Section 1. The dead do not lie in rows, they are scattered through the dark mud of a narrow river valley, separated by water, peat, roots, and more than 3,000 years of silence. A human arm bone rises from the bank with a flint arrowhead still driven into it. Elsewhere, a skull bears the violent mark of impact. Ribs, thigh bones, fragments of jaw, teeth worn by a life that ended suddenly, all lie where the slow river has protected them from complete disappearance. There is no monument here, no carved victory inscription, no ruined palace wall naming the king who ordered the advance or the men who broke and ran. There is only a wet landscape in what is now northern Germany, and the remains of people who met one another in violence around the 13th century before the Common Era. In the Tollens Valley, the earth does something rare. It does not merely suggest that an ancient battle happened, it gives back the bodies. The valley is quiet now, its waters small enough to seem incapable of carrying history. But in the Bronze Age, this was an open, marshy corridor, a low green passage through a sparsely settled land, crossed by a shallow river, and perhaps by an old causeway used by travellers moving through the region. There were no stone cities nearby, no immense fortresses looming above the water, no literate court recording the struggle on clay tablets. The people who lived across this northern landscape occupied farmsteads separated by woodland, wet ground, and long distances. Yet on one day, or over one short and brutal encounter, a force of astonishing size gathered here. More than 150 individuals have been identified among the recovered human remains, and the wider evidence suggests that the original clash involved far more people, perhaps thousands, for a world often imagined as scattered, local, and small scale. That realization lands with almost the force of the weapons themselves. Some of the dead were young men. Some bore wounds from earlier violence that had healed before this final encounter, suggesting that not everyone in the valley was an untested farmer suddenly pressed into danger. These were people who had survived injury before. Some may have understood weapons, formation, pursuit, and the instinctive calculation of when a line is about to break. The recovered traces include bronze and flint arrowheads, wooden clubs, evidence of sharp-edged blows, horse remains, and a small collection of bronze objects that may once have belonged to one participant moving through the chaos with valuables or tools close at hand. One skull was pierced at the back by a bronze arrowhead, a wound that carries an unbearable clarity. The victim was not facing the shot. He may have been fleeing, turning, crouching, or simply trapped in confusion when the arrow arrived. The evidence remains incomplete, but it preserves something. Written accounts often smooth away. Not the glory of battle, but its angle, its panic, its intimacy. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of the bloodiest ancient battles begins not with neat lists of kings and casualty totals, but with a more difficult question. What does it mean to call an ancient battle bloody when so much of the blood has vanished from the record? The greatest confrontations of the ancient world often reach the present through texts written by victors, survivors, officials, poets, priests, or historians working generations afterward. Their numbers can be enormous. Tens of thousands killed in an afternoon, entire armies swept away, rivers clogged with corpses, fields hidden beneath the fallen. Sometimes those descriptions reflect a real catastrophe. Sometimes they are shaped by pride, horror, political need, or the ancient desire to make an enemy seem vast enough that defeating him becomes almost superhuman. The deeper one enters the history of ancient war, the more one discovers that death is both brutally real and frustratingly difficult to count. At Tollens, there is no surviving storyteller to inflate or reduce the scale of what happened. There are bodies, weapons, sediment, chemical signatures preserved in teeth and bone, and a landscape that can still be studied. That gives the site a special authority, but not a complete answer. Archaeologists can establish that organised violence occurred here on an extraordinary scale for the region. They can examine wounds, date remains, compare weapon types, reconstruct parts of the ancient river environment, and ask whether some fighters had travelled from distant areas. Yet they cannot name the leaders. They cannot know what argument, alliance, raid, passage, debt, trade route, revenge, or political upheaval brought so many armed people into the valley. They cannot tell whether this was a planned interception at a crossing, a retreat that turned into a killing ground, a struggle between coalitions, or the final eruption of tensions that had been building beyond the surviving evidence. Scholars still debate the origins and precise composition of the forces involved. What remains certain is the outcome for those who never left the riverbank. Imagine the ground before the killing begins. The air is damp, reeds and sedges break the surface of the marsh, feet sink slightly as men move through the low terrain. Perhaps some come along the old crossing, perhaps others are already waiting. Bronze catches limited light on blades, fittings, ornaments, or arrowheads. But not every weapon is metal. Wood and stone remain lethal. The numbers themselves would make noise long before fighting begins, men breathing, horses shifting, water splashing at the edges of the route, gear striking against bodies, shouted signals now entirely lost, in an age without roads as later empires would know them, without marching camps described by historians, without administrative archives surviving to explain how such a force was assembled. The mere concentration of people is part of the mystery, feeding them, moving them, convincing or compelling them to fight. All implies networks of obligation and authority larger than older pictures of this world once allowed. Then the valley changes. Missiles fly across limited distances. Men fall into wet ground or water. Those trying to cross may become compressed in a narrow space where numbers no longer protect them. Those already wounded may be struck again. A mounted figure, important or merely fortunate enough to possess a horse, becomes vulnerable in the confusion. Clubs are not ceremonial when they strike bone. Arrows do not distinguish between a renowned fighter and someone whose name is never spoken beyond his home. If one side collapses, the valley offers poor escape mud, water, bottlenecks, reeds, men pressing from behind and attackers closing from the flank or rear. This is the aspect of battle that later heroic accounts often obscure. Most large killings do not occur when two sides stand bravely and evenly matched. They occur when order gives way, when one line disintegrates. When surrender is impossible or refused, when retreat becomes pursuit, and when the defeated are reduced from an army into individuals attempting to survive. Afterward, the living move among the dead, objects of value are removed, weapons that can be recovered may be carried away, bodies may be stripped, displaced, thrown or washed into the river, or left in the wet terrain where the slow chemistry of the valley begins its long preservation. This, too, is part of ancient battle. Victory does not end with the last blow. It continues in the taking of metal, clothing, equipment, animals, and perhaps captives. Bronze is wealth as well as weaponry. A dead man's possessions can return to circulation while his body becomes anonymous. Much later, when fragments of those bodies are recovered, their very incompleteness becomes evidence of what followed the fighting disturbance: scavenging, water movement, deliberate stripping, and the brutal efficiency with which the ancient world reused what the dead no longer needed. The surprise of tolerance is not simply that people killed one another long ago. Human beings have been capable of organised violence far deeper into prehistory than written records can follow. Earlier sites elsewhere reveal communities attacked, bodies thrown together, skulls broken, arrows lodged in bone, hands perhaps bound before death. Violence leaves old marks, but tolerance suggests something on another scale, people converging from beyond a single household feud or village attack. Armed in different ways, meeting in a landscape that became a battlefield rather than merely the scene of a raid. For generations, Bronze Age Europe north of the literate Mediterranean was too easily pictured as a world of beautiful metal objects. Distant trade, ritual deposits, and prestigious weapons carried mainly as signs of the rank. The valley forces a correction. Some of those weapons were used. Some systems of exchange and movement were also systems capable of bringing armed men together. Beneath the polished bronze lies mud, shattered bone, and organised fear. Yet even here, where the bodies survive, the word bloodiest must be handled carefully. The excavated dead represent only those preserved, found, and identified in a particular stretch of landscape. Others may have been carried away by companions, buried somewhere unknown, lost downstream, destroyed by soil conditions, or never recovered at all. An estimate of the total dead must grow outward from partial evidence. In later battles, the problem changes form but does not disappear. There may be precise-sounding casualty figures, yet no bodies accessible for examination. There may be triumphal claims announcing that an enemy army was annihilated, yet those claims served rulers who benefited from magnifying victory. There may be chroniclers who copied older reports, converted rumours into totals, or treated slaughter as proof that divine favour had chosen the winning side. A battlefield can be physically undeniable and numerically uncertain. A number can be carefully written and historically unreliable. Ancient death is often caught somewhere between bone and boast. This is why the most terrible battles cannot simply be ranked like entries in an account book. A battle that kills 10,000 men in a few hours may be more concentrated in its horror than a campaign that kills far more through famine, execution, disease, enslavement, and the destruction of cities. An army cut down while retreating may leave fewer famous stories than a heroic last stand, even if the actual killing is greater. A victorious ruler may record enemy deaths but ignore civilians. Camp followers, captives, and the defeated who die later from wounds or exposure. In many societies, the dead who mattered politically were not the same as all the dead who existed. Kings counted enemies to advertise power. Communities remembered their own losses through absence, inheritance, abandoned homes, altered marriages, missing labour, and sons who did not return at harvest. The human body, by contrast, has no interest in propaganda. A healed fracture suggests an earlier encounter with danger. An unhealed impact records violence near the moment of death. An embedded projectile preserves direction and force. Patterns of age, sex, diet, origin, injury, and burial or abandonment slowly reveal the structure of a catastrophe. They can show that the people involved were not imagined. They stood somewhere. They consumed food from particular regions. They endured pain before dying. They were left in ways shaped by the people who survived them. Archaeology does not return their voices, but it can prevent them from dissolving entirely into the impressive claims of rulers and the tidy abstractions of military history. And so the journey into the bloodiest battles of the ancient world begins not beneath the walls of a famous city, not with an emperor announcing his triumph, and not with a historian presenting a convenient total. It begins beside a cold river, among nameless bones, because this is where the nature of the problem becomes visible. Ancient warfare survives unevenly. Sometimes it leaves an inscription claiming the impossible. Sometimes it leaves a burned gate, an abandoned settlement, a mass grave, a scattered line of arrowheads, or an entire generation dimly visible through demographic collapse. Sometimes victory is so thoroughly recorded that defeat becomes almost voiceless. Sometimes the only witnesses are the wounds. The people who died at Tollens could not have known that their final hours would become evidence in a story far larger than their own conflict. They could not know that the wet ground beneath them would preserve a warning against imagining the distant past as gentler simply because it's quiet now. Their battlefield has no surviving name. Its cause is hidden, its leaders have vanished, but its dead stand at the threshold of ancient war, reminding the present that behind every famous number still to come lies the same physical truth: a body struck, a line broken, a landscape changed, and those who remain trying to give meaning to the silence after the killing ends. Once violence acquires a king, it also acquires an image. Long before anyone leaves a readable description of troops advancing across a plain, Egypt presents the ruler as the man who masters chaos by striking down an enemy. On a ceremonial stone pallet made around the dawn of pharaonic history, King Narmer stands larger than every other human figure, one arm raised, a mace poised above the head of a kneeling captive. The enemy is not merely defeated, he is reduced to helplessness beneath royal power. On the reverse, rows of decapitated bodies lie arranged for inspection, their heads placed deliberately between their legs, while the king proceeds through a world ordered by victory. It is one of the most famous surviving images from early Egypt, and one of the first warnings that written and visual records of ancient warfare will never be neutral windows onto killing. The palette does not show battle as those caught inside it would have experienced it. It shows what kingship wants battle to mean. Whether Narmer's imagery preserves a specific campaign, compresses several struggles, or expresses the ideal of domination in symbolic form remains debated. Early Egypt almost certainly did not emerge without conflict. Rival centres along the Nile competed in a landscape where control of farmland, trade routes, labour, prestige goods, and religious authority could strengthen one ruler at the expense of another. Yet the unification of Egypt was not a single clean duel between two neatly defined kingdoms, however convenient that story later became. The evidence remains incomplete. What survives most powerfully is the language of power itself, the bound captive, the broken enemy, the ruler whose violence is presented as the restoration of balance. That language would endure for thousands of years. Pharaoh after pharaoh would be shown smiting foreigners who threaten Egypt from the deserts, from Nubia to the south, or from the lands of Western Asia beyond the Sinai. The image barely needed to change because its message was not about the uncertainties of one particular fight. It said that the world remains stable because the king defeats those who disturb it. Real campaigns were messier. Egyptian armies marched into heat, dust, difficult terrain, hunger, bad intelligence, resistant towns, and regions where political loyalty could change with distance from Egyptian power. Men died in raids and sieges, on river expeditions and desert approaches, in skirmishes that never earned a carved scene. But the monumental surface removed almost all of this confusion. There, the king always stands upright, the enemy always collapses. For much of Egyptian history, warfare appears through such controlled fragments: inscriptions announcing victories, scenes of captives, tomb autobiographies of officials who accompanied expeditions, lists of plunder, descriptions of defeated regions, and fortified landscapes along threatened frontiers. Egypt's kings send armies into Nubia for resources and control, eastward into Sinai for minerals and security, and northward into the Levant where city-states, trade routes, timber, tribute. And rival powers make the region too important to ignore. Some expeditions are punitive, some are intended to secure influence, some protect the flow of goods, some respond to resistance, and some are remembered as triumphant whether or not the fighting was as decisive as the royal record suggests. For the dead themselves, the difference may have mattered less than it does to historians. An arrow fired beside a mud brick wall or a spear thrust during a pursuit ends a life regardless of whether the campaign later receives a glorious inscription. Then Egypt itself is transformed by foreign rule and renewed expansion. During the Second Intermediate Period, rulers known as the Hyksos control much of northern Egypt from the delta, while southern Egyptian kings eventually fight to drive them out. The struggles that reunify the country help draw Egypt more deeply into the military and political world of Western Asia. By the beginning of the New Kingdom, Egyptian rulers no longer see security as something that ends at the Nile frontier. A hostile coalition in Canaan or Syria can threaten the network of tribute, allegiance, and buffer territories that now protects Egyptian interests. Chariots, composite bows, mobile campaigning, and garrisoned influence become part of a more outward-facing military system. Egypt has become not only a kingdom capable of defending itself, but an imperial power capable of carrying war far from home. In this world, around the 15th century before the Common Era, Thutmose III faces the challenge that will produce the first ancient battle narrated in sustained detail. For years, he had ruled alongside and in the shadow of Hatshepsut, the formidable female pharaoh whose monuments presented her authority with the full language of kingship. After her death, Thutmose becomes sole ruler, and in his 23rd regnal year a coalition of Levantine princes gathers against Egyptian authority. At its centre stands the ruler of Kadesh, supported by powers whose resistance threatens to unravel Egypt's hold over Canaan. The coalition assembles near Megiddo, a strongly situated city commanding routes through the Jezreel Valley. This is not an obscure outpost. Whoever controls Megiddo can influence the roads connecting Egypt, the coast, inland Canaan, and the northern approaches towards Syria. A revolt gathered there is not only an insult to royal prestige, it is a strategic danger. Thutmose marches north, The distance itself is a reminder of what an organised ancient state can now accomplish. Men, chariots, horses, weapons, food, messengers, officers, scribes, and all the material demands of an army pushed across long stretches of contested land. Unlike the nameless violence of Jebel Sahaba, or the silent clash beside the Tollens River, this campaign comes with a voice. The account later carved at Karnak claims to draw upon a campaign record kept during the expedition. It gives places, decisions, captured goods, and the dramatic movement toward battle. Yet it is still an Egyptian royal record placed in a temple of Amun, shaped to celebrate the pharaoh and the god credited with granting victory. It brings the battlefield closer than earlier evidence does, while never allowing the defeated to speak. As the Egyptian army nears Megiddo, it faces a choice of approaches. Two routes are broad enough to appear safer. The central path through the pass at Aruna is narrow and dangerous, a place where a force stretched out along the road might be attacked before it can deploy. The royal account presents Thutmose's officers as warning him against the risk. The pharaoh chooses the dangerous route anyway. Whether the reported exchange preserves the word actually spoken or has been heightened to emphasize royal courage. The military dilemma is real enough. A cautious army arriving by the expected road may find the coalition ready. A bold force moving through the narrow pass risks disaster, but may emerge where the enemy has not prepared to meet it. The Egyptians enter the defile. Men and chariots pass through constrained terrain where numbers offer little comfort. For some time, the front of the force may be emerging while others are still behind, vulnerable to any enemy who understands what is happening quickly enough. But the coalition does not crush them in the pass. Thutmose reaches the valley and assembles his army. The enemy has been forced into a sudden confrontation near the city, whose protection it expected to use on its own terms. What follows is described as a decisive Egyptian assault, with the pharaoh occupying the central, commanding position, and the opposing force giving way before him. Beneath that royal image lies the practical horror of armies, meeting at close range, chariots manoeuvring where the ground permits, archers sending missiles toward crowded targets, infantry pressing forward, frightened horses turning unpredictably, commanders losing control as units collapse into flight. The coalition breaks. Men run for Megiddo, seeking safety behind walls that remain their strongest defence. In the confusion, the city gates are closed too soon, perhaps to prevent Egyptian troops from rushing in with the fugitives. Those caught outside are hauled upward by garments lowered from the walls. It is an astonishingly human detail preserved in an official record defeated fighters scrambling not for honour but for survival. Pulled vertically towards safety while their enemies occupy the field below. Had the pursuing Egyptian troops driven immediately after them, Megiddo might have fallen in the panic. Instead, they turned to the abandoned camp and its riches. That decision gives the ancient account an unusual moment of criticism. The soldiers seize chariots, horses, armour, weapons, tents, and valuable goods, allowing the leaders of the rebellion and many surviving fighters to escape behind the fortifications. To the men looting the camp, the impulse must have been understandable. A captured chariot, metal armour, weapon, horse, or prestigious object could represent wealth beyond anything a common soldier might normally touch. Battle has always contained this temptation once an enemy turns and leaves possessions behind. Victory feels as if it has already been achieved. But Megiddo is not yet won. Because the army pauses to gather wealth, a battle that might have ended with the immediate seizure of the city becomes a siege. The Egyptians surround Megiddo, containing it until resistance can no longer continue. The surviving record emphasises the scale of the spoils eventually collected: hundreds of chariots, hundreds of bows, armour, livestock in enormous numbers, captured people, and the possessions associated with the defeated elite. This counting is crucial. Earlier royal images show enemies subdued as symbols. At Megiddo, victory is transformed into inventory. Chariots, horses, cattle, sheep, prisoners, equipment, and tribute become evidence of success. The battlefield is made legible to the state through what can be taken away and offered to the god or absorbed into royal power. What is far less clear is how many people died. Megiddo is often remembered as the first battle recorded in substantial detail, but its record does not provide the kind of reliable casualty total that would allow the dead to be measured with confidence. The account cares deeply about captured wealth and the submission of rulers. It cares about the strategic brilliance and divine favour of Thutmose. It cares that rebellion has been punished and Egypt's reach restored. The bodies scattered in the field matter mainly because they are part of the proof of victory. The ordinary Canaanite fighter killed while running toward the walls, and the Egyptian archer or chariot crewman lost during the assault, disappear behind the grander accounting of empire. This silence is itself revealing. For rulers, battle is often most meaningful not when men die, but when death produces control. The victory at Megiddo is important because it helps restore Egyptian authority through the region and opens the way for further campaigns. Local rulers must reckon again with the power of the Nile Kingdom. Tribute can flow, strategic routes can be watched. The sons of subject rulers may be drawn into Egyptian influence. Educated within a system designed to make future loyalty more likely, a single day of fighting expands into a long political afterlife. Men who survive the battlefield live beneath altered obligations. Cities retain their walls but lose part of their freedom. Victory becomes administration. At Karnak, many years after the campaign, the story is placed permanently into sacred architecture. Visitors passing through the temple encounter not the smell of sweat, blood, horse dung, smoke, and dust, but a composed record of royal achievement. The campaign becomes a gift to Amun, a demonstration that divine support and pharaonic action are inseparable. In that transformation lies one of history's most persistent problems. Without royal inscription, much of the battle would be lost. Because of royal inscription, the battle comes to the present already arranged around the needs of its victor. Megiddo therefore marks a threshold. The ancient battlefield is no longer only a pit, a riverbank, a burned settlement, or a wound in bone. It has become narrative. It has a route, a decision, a king, an enemy coalition, a moment of flight, a siege, and a list of captured wealth. Yet the new clarity creates new shadows. Men can now be killed beneath the gaze of writing, and still remain uncounted. A ruler can preserve a battle for more than 3,000 years, while preserving almost nothing of what defeat felt like to those trapped outside the gates. The bloodiest wars to come will increasingly be recorded by states that know how to present killing as greatness. They will place chariots in motion across open ground, turn ruined cities into proof of destiny, and make immense claims for the dead left behind. Egypt has shown how the memory of battle can outlast the bodies. Soon, at another confrontation among chariots, kings and scribes will shape not merely a victory, but a dispute over what victory means at all. The bones in the river valley belong to a world already capable of gathering fighters in frightening numbers. But the path to such a battlefield does not begin with armies. It begins with smaller traces, scattered far deeper in time, when death by another human hand appears in the archaeological record without revealing whether it came from murder, revenge, raid, or war. One skeleton with a projectile wound is a tragedy. A cemetery in which many people carry the marks of repeated attack is something darker, a sign that violence may have become part of how communities lived beside one another, feared one another, and competed to remain alive. More than 13,000 years ago, beside the Nile in what is now Sudan, people buried their dead at a place known as Jebel Sahaba. The landscape they knew was not a stable green ribbon flowing gently through unchanging desert. The end of the Ice Age brought shifts in rainfall, river behaviour, food sources, and habitable ground. Groups living close to water depended upon places where fish, game, edible plants, and access routes could sustain them. And those places may have become more contested as the environment changed. When the cemetery was first studied, its many wounded individuals seemed to preserve the aftermath of one extraordinary massacre, perhaps one of the oldest battles ever discovered. Later re-examination made the picture more troubling rather than less. Many of the dead showed injuries associated with projectiles. Some had wounds that healed before death, while others bore fresh trauma. This does not look simply like one fatal afternoon. It may record repeated episodes of assault over years, perhaps raids and ambushes between groups whose lives were being pressed into the same narrowing opportunities. That distinction matters. A single battle has a beginning and an end, however terrible it may be. Recurrent violence enters daily life. It means that someone struck by a projectile once may survive, heal, and later face attack again. It means children grow within a landscape where danger is remembered not as legend but as family experience. It means a fishing place, a seasonal route, or a shoreline can carry the expectation of attack. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence at Jebel Sahaba. Climate pressure does not automatically cause killing, and human communities can answer hardship through movement, exchange, cooperation, or negotiation. But a changing environment can sharpen all divisions, make access to reliable resources harder to share, and turn a place of subsistence into a place worth defending or taking. Thousands of years later, and far to the southeast, near the ancient shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya, another group of dead preserves a different and fiercely debated glimpse of violence. At Nataruk, bodies dating to roughly 10,000 years ago were found without the ordered arrangement of a cemetery. Some carried severe injuries, one had stone material associated with a wound, and several appeared to have died where they fell. The setting was once far more generous than its modern dryness suggests. A lakeside environment attractive to hunter-gatherers because it offered water, fish, animals, and perhaps goods worth carrying or storing. The original interpretation saw Nataruk as the remains of an attacked group, proof that lethal intergroup conflict existed among people who had not yet built towns or farmed fields. Other scholars challenge parts of that reconstruction, questioning whether every injury and body position proves a single massacre. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the dispute itself exposes the difficulty that will follow every ancient killing field. Violence is often clear, while its scale, purpose, and organisation remain harder to recover. Neither Jebel Sahaba nor Nataruk proves that humanity was born marching into war. Prehistory is too long, too varied, and too unevenly preserved for a simple verdict about human nature. Countless communities left no obvious trace of collective slaughter, and absence of evidence cannot always tell whether peace prevailed or whether the dead were treated in ways that archaeology cannot find. What these sites do show is that lethal conflict did not need kings, cities, written orders, or bronze swords to exist. Long before palaces recorded campaigns, small groups could encounter one another with fatal intent. A thrown point, an ambush near water, an attack at a campsite, or a raid aimed at rivals could produce grief as complete as any later imperial war, even if it produced no army list and no carved boast. The transformation comes slowly, as human communities begin changing the landscape in more permanent ways. Farming does not invent violence, but it alters what can be attacked and what cannot easily be abandoned. A mobile group faced with danger may move, though never without cost. A village tied to fields, harvested grain, livestock, houses, wells, stored seed, ancestors buried nearby, and routes to nearby resources carries a different kind of vulnerability. Land now contains work accumulated across seasons. Stored food can be seized, animals can be driven away, houses can be burned, people can be killed not only in an encounter, but in an attempt to clear, terrorize, capture, or replace an entire community. In early Neolithic Central Europe, communities associated with the first widespread farming traditions raised timber houses and cultivated a continent still thick with woodland. Their settlements were not cities, and their lives were not governed by empires. Yet several sites preserve a violence that is difficult to mistake for isolated anger. At Talheim in present-day Germany, a pit contained the bodies of men, women, and children killed around 7,000 years ago, many by blows to the head. At Schöneck-Kilienstädten, another settlement produced remains of victims who had suffered lethal attacks, with some lower legs deliberately broken before or around the time of death. Such details are hard to hear because they strip away comforting distance. These were not merely enemies defeated while armed and resisting. Entire households appear vulnerable. Children are among the dead. What survives in the record suggests not only conflict, but attacks directed at communities as communities. While one village struck another cannot be reconstructed with certainty, there may have been competition over fertile ground, cycles of revenge, efforts to seize people, fear of outsiders, social breakdown, or pressures that left neighbours less willing to tolerate one another. At some sites, the pattern of who is present and absent has raised the possibility that selected people, perhaps young women, were taken away rather than killed. Though scholars still debate how confidently motives can be assigned from missing bodies, the important shift lies elsewhere. Once wealth grows from land, harvest, animals, tools, and stored surplus, violence can aim at possession and control. It can also become planned. A settlement can be approached, surrounded, surprised, and destroyed. Killing becomes not just an act between individuals, but a means of changing who occupies a place. With settled life come defences, ditches, palisades, walls, gates, watchpoints, and clustered buildings do not all prove warfare. Communities build barriers for animals, flood control, status, and ritual as well as fear. But in some places, fortification, burned destruction layers, weapons, and wounded bodies begin to form a recognisable pattern. More people are living close together. Their food supports specialists, leaders, craftspeople, and labourers who can be directed toward large works. Trade moves desirable materials over long distances. Authority becomes more visible, and inequality becomes easier to defend. A raid on a camp may kill. An assault on a fortified settlement can decide who controls stores, workshops, exchange routes, and the labour of survivors. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, parts of Mesopotamia are undergoing this transformation with extraordinary speed. Settlements swell into towns and cities, irrigated production, craft manufacture, temple institutions, long-distance commerce, and systems of administration bind large numbers of people into arrangements no family or small village could command alone. Clay tokens and ceilings track goods, workshops multiply, walls define not merely shelter but political space. In the dry plains and river-fed zones of the Near East, power gathers behind mud-brick architecture, and with it gathers the ability to compel labour, provision armed men, and direct organised attacks. At Hamakkar in northeastern Syria, archaeology catches one of these early urban centres at the moment violence reached its walls. Around 3,500 BC, long before the great empires normally associated with Mesopotamian war, the city suffered a destructive assault. Excavators found collapsed and burned buildings, sling projectiles, and signs of intense fighting. The projectiles are an especially stark discovery, small clay bullets shaped for use with slings. With thousands recovered from the destruction context, a storm of manufactured ammunition aimed into an urban conflict. Some were found amid ruins as though the attack had stopped only when the structures fell, and fire completed what weapons began. Whether this event should be called the First War is impossible to declare. The First War may be lost beyond recognition, but Hamakkar reveals something unmistakable. Organised communities were now capable of attacking a city with prepared missiles and leaving urban destruction in their wake. There is a terrible arithmetic behind that development. To kill on a large scale, a society needs more than anger. It needs people who can be summoned or persuaded to fight, food to sustain them, weapons or ammunition produced in quantity, routes by which forces can move, and leaders or institutions able to direct effort toward an enemy. The same growing complexity that allows irrigation channels, temples, storage, trade, and monumental building also allows the concentration of force. Organisation has no moral direction of its own. It can bring grain through scarcity and stones into a sanctuary. It can also place thousands of sling bullets in the hands of attackers outside a wall. Along the Nile, a related process takes a distinct Egyptian form. Villages and regional centres grow amid rich floodplain agriculture and desert margins, rich in symbolic and material resources. Competition among rising powers is preserved less through reliable battle reports than through imagery-bound captives, defeated bodies, standards, rulers displayed as overwhelming figures who strike enemies down. The famous royal image of the smiting king does not tell how many men truly died in any one confrontation, nor does it prove that Egypt was united in one simple campaign. State formation is rarely as clean as later royal memory makes it appear, But the imagery announces a new political truth. Violence has become part of kingship itself. A ruler does not merely defend his followers, he presents himself as the man who creates order by crushing those placed outside it. This is the threshold over which the nameless dead of the earlier world begin to be followed by named powers. In the marshes, on lake edges, and in farming pits, violence can be reconstructed only through bodies and damaged settlements. With cities and kings, it gains walls, workshops, supply systems, official images, and eventually writing. Armies do not appear suddenly, fully formed, in a heroic age of chariots and bronze. They are assembled from much older fears and newer possibilities. From the defence of food and water, from the possession of land, from the authority to command labour, and from the conviction that another community's destruction can secure one's own future. Soon, rulers will begin leaving versions of battle behind deliberately. They will claim triumph, display captives, count severed hands or defeated enemies, and shape violence into memory. Their records will illuminate ancient warfare, but they will also complicate it, because the man who commands a battle is rarely the best witness to its cost. Before those voices rise from monuments and inscriptions, the earliest trail is already clear enough. The bloodiest battles require more than weapons. They require societies that have learned how to bring many lives together, how to direct them toward one place, and how to accept that a field, a gate, or a riverbank may consume them all. The king who rides through the inscriptions of Megiddo leaves behind a model of victory that later pharaohs understand perfectly. An army may struggle, hesitate, plunder too early, or find itself delayed before walls, but the monument can still arrange the confusion into a story of royal mastery. 2 centuries later, that skill will be needed more than ever, because on the plain before Kadesh, an Egyptian pharaoh does not simply meet a powerful enemy. He walks into a trap, watches part of his army collapse, and survives a day whose memory he will spend the rest of his reign controlling. The prize is the same northern corridor that drew Thutmose III toward Megiddo, but the balance of power has changed. Egypt remains formidable, ruling through garrisons, tribute, and allied cities in the Levant. Yet beyond them stands Hatti, the Hittite kingdom based in Anatolia, an imperial power with its own vassals and its own claim upon Syria. Between them lies a contested world of city rulers and shifting loyalties. Kadesh, standing near the Orontes River, is a hinge in the struggle for northern Syria. Holding it means shaping the frontier. Rameses II is still early in his long reign when he goes north in his 5th year, commonly dated to about 1274 before the Common Era. He has inherited not only a throne but an imperial expectation. Pharaoh must be seen to extend Egyptian order outward, to punish resistance and make foreign rulers recognise the weight of his name. His army marches in 4 major divisions named for gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. Each division is a moving body of infantry, chariots, officers, supplies, animals, servants, and camp equipment, separated along the road because an enormous army cannot pass through the landscape as one compact mass. Somewhere ahead, the Hittite king Muwatalli II has gathered forces from across his political world, including vassals and allies drawn into a confrontation, whose scale makes Kadesh one of the most celebrated chariot battles of antiquity. Ancient descriptions and modern reconstructions speak of thousands of chariots, though the exact totals remain uncertain. What is clear is the level of organisation required: horses fed and watered through a long campaign, wheels maintained, bows and arrows supplied, commanders informed, infantry moved into position, and the loyalty of distant subordinate rulers translated into men willing to fight. A chariot is an expensive, demanding weapons platform, dependent upon trained horses, skilled crews, suitable ground, and support behind it. Egyptian chariots are often understood as light and manoeuvrable. Hittite vehicles are often represented as heavier, though reality may have been more varied than that contrast suggests. Thousands of horses and wheeled vehicles gathered near a river city would raise a storm of dust and noise. This is warfare far removed from a village raid. The violence of palaces, granaries, roads, messengers, and subject peoples. As the Egyptians approach Kadesh, 2 men appear before Rameses and claim that the Hittite army is far away, somewhere to the north. They are presented in the Egyptian account as Shasu nomads, agents planted to mislead the pharaoh. Their report is exactly what an advancing commander wants to hear. The enemy is distant, the city is within reach, speed may secure the advantage. Rameses moves ahead with the Amun division and makes camp near Kadesh, while the rest of his army remains stretched behind him on the march. The Ra division follows at a distance. Ptah and Seth are farther away. The Egyptian force has not yet gathered into a defensible whole. The king believes he has time. Then the truth arrives in a more violent form. Egyptian scouts seize Hittite men, and under interrogation the prisoners reveal that Muwatalli is not far away at all. His forces are concealed nearby, across or beyond the terrain around Kadesh, waiting while the Egyptian divisions remain separated. In the royal telling, Rameses turns on his officers for their failure to discover the danger, and urgent messages rush south to bring up the delayed troops. But the time for orderly correction is almost gone. The Hittite king has achieved what battlefield commanders seek and rarely obtain so perfectly: an opponent divided, partly encamped, partly marching, and unaware of the blow already beginning to fall. Hittite chariots surge across the river and strike the Ra division, while it is still moving toward the camp. The attack does not arrive as a formal meeting of prepared lines. It bursts into men and vehicles caught in movement, breaking formation before they can fully respond. Soldiers scatter, Chariots overturn or flee. The wrecked division is driven toward the Egyptian camp, carrying panic with it. Men from Ra crash among the Amun troops and the royal encampment, while pursuing Hittite chariots pour through the disorder. For a moment, the carefully supplied centre of Egyptian power becomes a place of collapse. Tents, shields, animals, baggage, servants, officers, and frightened troops mingle in a space no longer governed by command. A pharaoh who had marched north to display strength now stands dangerously close to defeat, capture, or death. The Egyptian monuments will later turn this crisis into the essential proof of Ramesses' greatness. In the long narrative often called the poem, and in the accompanying report and relief scenes repeated on temple walls, the king is abandoned, surrounded, and forced to call upon Amun. The god answers by giving him strength. Ramesses charges alone or nearly alone into the multitudes of Hatti, cutting them down and sending terrified enemies into the river. The imagery is overwhelming. On temple walls, the pharaoh is vastly larger than the men around him, his horses surging forward as enemy chariots tumble into confusion. The Hittite king remains at a distance, unable or unwilling to face him. This is royal memory at its most confident disaster transformed into isolation. Isolation transformed into divine favour, and survival transformed into triumph. Behind that construction, a real recovery seems to have taken place. The Hittite chariot force having broken into the Egyptian camp, they have lost cohesion as fighters stop to seize the wealth spread before them. Once again, as at Megiddo, plunder interrupts victory. A force that has achieved shock and confusion becomes dispersed amid tents, baggage, and captured goods. Egyptian resistance stiffens. Ramesses' bodyguard and the troops still able to fight rally around the threatened centre. A contingent often identified in the Egyptian sources as the near-in arrives at a crucial moment, though who precisely they were and how they reached the battlefield remains debated. As additional Egyptian forces approach, the Hittite attackers face counterblows in ground where their earlier momentum has faded. Men who had entered the camp as hunters now find themselves pressed toward the river, with chariots damaged, horses exhausted or wounded, and escape narrowed by the mass of others trying to withdraw. The images of the retreat are as deliberate as they are unforgettable. Hittite men fall into the Orontes. A prince of Aleppo is shown being hauled from the water and revived after nearly drowning, a humiliating detail designed to make Egypt's enemies look helpless beneath Ramesses' assault. Named Hittite nobles appear among the fallen in the Egyptian presentation, lending apparent specificity to the victory. Yet even here the account does not allow a clean count of the dead. Both armies almost certainly suffered serious losses. The violent shock against Ray, the invasion of the Egyptian camp, the counterattack, the river crossing, and the repeated movement of chariots through men and horses cannot have been bloodless. But casualty numbers are not securely recoverable. The wall scenes do what royal battle scenes are designed to do: they give death a direction. Egyptian disorder is temporary and heroic. Hittite death is abundant, shameful, and proof of the pharaoh's power. What matters most is what does not happen after the fighting. Ramesses does not take Kadesh. Muwatalli is not destroyed. The Hittite king retains the strategic position that had drawn the Egyptians so far north in the first place. Egyptian inscriptions can claim that the enemy has been shattered before the king, and Ramesses may indeed have rescued his army from a potentially catastrophic trap, perhaps even ending the day in command of the field. But an army rescued from destruction is not the same as an empire advancing its frontier. Kadesh remains beyond secure Egyptian possession, and the contested northern lands do not simply fall obediently into Ramesses' hands. Scholars still debate exactly how to describe the result: Egyptian tactical recovery, Hittite strategic success, bloody stalemate, or some combination of all three. No single label fully accounts for a battle in which one ruler survives an ambush and celebrates victory, while the other prevents his enemy from achieving the campaign's central goal. That ambiguity helps explain why Kadesh is carved and copied with such intensity. The story appears again and again on Egyptian temple walls and in written versions, including a surviving papyrus. A victory too obvious may require less explanation. Kadesh demands a narrative because its reality is uncomfortable. The pharaoh has been deceived. His forces have been caught apart. A major division has been struck in motion. The royal camp has been breached. Only after severe danger does the Egyptian army recover. The result is not silence, but repetition, as if every colossal relief and every renewed telling makes the official meaning harder to question. Ramesses becomes not the ruler whose intelligence failed, but the ruler who stood alone when others failed him. His most dangerous day becomes one of the pillars of his public identity. The Hittite view survives less theatrically, but the political map speaks with considerable force. Hatti remains a great power. Conflict and rivalry continue, years later, after Muwatalli's death and after shifts within the Hittite royal house. Ramesses II and Hattusili III conclude a famous treaty, preserved in Egyptian and Hittite versions. It is sometimes attached in popular memory directly to Kadesh, though it comes many years after the battle and responds to a broader world of mutual advantage, frontier tension, dynastic legitimacy, and rising threats. Its existence does not prove that Kadesh alone made peace inevitable. It does reveal that neither empire could easily erase the other. The era of grand chariot confrontation ends not with one ruler standing permanently over a conquered rival, but with two powers recognizing that survival may require agreement where battle had failed to produce decision. And beneath all of this political calculation lie the fragile things on which the great display depended: a false report accepted too readily, a division too far behind, horses that tire, chariot wheels that break, men who stop to plunder when discipline might have finished the work, messengers struggling to reach units scattered along a road, a river that becomes a barrier only after retreat begins, imperial warfare projects certainty on stone. But its real machinery is vulnerable at every point. A ruler may command thousands of men and still find himself endangered by one error in information and one enemy who moves at the right moment. Kadesh is bloody not because its dead can be numbered with confidence, but because it exposes the scale and instability of Bronze Age war at its height. Here are two of the ancient world's mightiest powers, drawing men, horses, wealth, and loyalty from vast distances, meeting in a conflict immense enough to fill temple walls and uncertain enough to require them. The blood dries on the plain, the city remains, the kings continue. What survives is a vision of Ramesses charging through enemies beneath the favour of a god. What lingers behind that vision is more unsettling. A powerful army entering battle convinced it controls events, and discovering in a single rush of chariots how quickly an empire's confidence can be cut open. Kadesh shows kings fighting to control the meaning of an uncertain result. In Greece, several centuries later, the problem becomes larger still, because the battles against Persia will not merely be remembered as campaigns. They will be turned into the foundation story of a civilization of free men standing against imperial multitudes, narrow passes and wooden ships rescuing a fragile world from conquest, heroic death acquiring a brightness that makes the killing almost beautiful from a distance. The battles were real, the consequences were immense, men died in numbers that terrified those who survived, but almost everything later generations believe about these wars comes through Greek voices, above all the history written by Herodotus, a writer of extraordinary curiosity whose account preserves precious detail while also carrying the fears, pride, rumour, and memory of the communities that endured the Persian invasions. At every blood-soaked field, the same question returns. How much can victory be trusted when victory becomes the storyteller? The Persian Empire that reaches toward the Aegean is not a faceless horde appearing suddenly from the east. It is one of the ancient world's most sophisticated political creations, built through the conquest of Cyrus the Great and his successors, stretching across an astonishing variety of peoples, languages, landscapes, and traditions. Its kings rule not only by force but through roads, governors, tribute systems, royal communication, negotiated local authority, and a capacity to bring distant regions into a single imperial structure. Greek cities already exist inside that structure along the coast of Asia Minor. When several rebel against Persian rule in the Ionian Revolt, supported in part by ships from Athens and Eretria, they ignite a conflict far larger than the burning of a distant regional capital or the punishment of rebellious cities. The revolt is eventually crushed. But Athens has entered the king's attention. An imperial power has a long memory when a small city assists in setting fire to royal authority. In 490 before the Common Era, a Persian expedition crosses the Aegean. Eretria falls first, its temples are burned, and its people are carried away. A warning written not in rhetoric but in captivity. Then the fleet reaches the plain of Marathon, on the northeastern side of Attica, where open ground offers room for landing, manoeuvre, and perhaps cavalry operations. Athens faces a decision with no guarantee of survival. Its citizen army is not large, Sparta. The most respected land power among the Greeks, does not arrive in time, delayed according to tradition by religious observance. The small city of Plataea sends support, an alliance remembered with gratitude long after other loyalties prove less stable. Around 10,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans stand before a Persian force whose true number remains debated, but which is certainly formidable enough to threaten the existence of Athens itself. There is no marble calm in the hours before Marathon. The city behind the army contains families who know what happened to Eretria. Defeat may mean more than losing a field. It may mean burning houses, desecrated sanctuaries, men killed, women and children enslaved, and an end to the fragile political experiment Athens has only recently begun to develop. Among the fighters stands Aeschylus, later famous as a tragedian. But in the inscription associated with his memory, it is not his plays that matter most. It is his service at Marathon. The battle is not yet a legend. It is a line of men gripping shields while an imperial army waits across the plain. The Greek formation advances, and the central drama of Marathon is born from pressure and reversal. Heavy infantrymen carrying round shields and thrusting spears must cross open ground under the threat of Persian missile fire. The Athenian line is arranged with stronger wings and a thinner centre. When contact comes, the Persian centre presses successfully against the weaker Greek middle, but on the flanks the Athenians and Plataeans prevail, then turn inward upon those advancing between them. An army that had appeared to be breaking through discovers that its sides are giving way. The order of battle collapses. Men begin to run toward the ships and toward the marshy ground near the coast, where flight itself may become lethal. The killing grows most intense not in the first impact, but in the pursuit, when the defeated are no longer presenting a unified line of shields and weapons, but are struggling to reach vessels before their enemies close upon them. Herodotus gives a clean and astonishing count: 192 Athenians dead, with the Plataeans also suffering losses, against 6,400 Persian dead. Perhaps the Athenians counted bodies on the field, and perhaps the figure preserves a real reckoning shaped by the victory mound and the honour given to those who fell. Yet the imbalance naturally invites caution. The dead of a routed army can indeed accumulate rapidly, especially against heavily armed pursuers and dangerous terrain. The Persians may also have lost men in the marsh or during the violent struggle at the ships, but ancient casualty figures, particularly those recording enemy losses, rarely reach the present without problems. What can be said with confidence is that the Persian force withdraws and Athens survives. The mound raised over the Athenian dead remains in the landscape. Less a statement about thousands of unknown enemies than a concentrated memory of the citizens who did not walk back to the city they had preserved. Marathon quickly becomes more than a military success. It offers Athens a story about itself, ordinary citizens standing in the line, bearing the danger directly, defending a homeland without waiting for rescue. Yet the victory does not end Persian attention to Greece. An empire with the resources of Persia can absorb an unsuccessful expedition. 10 years later, the invasion returns with a weight the Greeks have never faced before. The Persian king is now Xerxes, son of Darius. And his undertaking is immense troops gathered from across imperial territories, a fleet moving along the coast, bridges across the Hellespont, supply preparations, engineers, commanders, horses, ships, and countless dependent decisions that must hold together as the force moves westward. Herodotus gives numbers for Xerxes' forces so enormous that most modern historians reject them as impossible to sustain. Even greatly reduced estimates still describe a host overwhelming by the standards of divided Greek city-states. The exaggeration, if exaggeration it is, tells its own truth. To the Greeks facing that advance, Persia does not feel merely larger, it feels almost beyond measurement. The first land barrier chosen by the resisting Greeks is Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, where mountains once pressed close against the sea and reduced the useful passage southward. The terrain is the weapon. In open country, a much larger force can extend, maneuver, and overwhelm. In a narrow pass, numbers choke behind one another. King Leonidas of Sparta leads a force of several thousand Greeks from different communities, including the famous 300 Spartans selected with an awareness that the expedition may demand everything from them. Later memory narrows the scene until almost only Spartans remain, but Thermopylae is defended by a coalition, and among those who remain at the end are 700 Thespians whose sacrifice is every bit as final and far less often spoken. For 2 days, the pass holds. Persian attacks enter ground that denies them the full use of their advantage. Greek hoplites, trained to fight behind shields with long thrusting spears, occupy a deadly front where the pressure of repeated assault does not immediately break them. Persian losses may have been substantial, though the enormous numbers later attributed to them cannot simply be accepted. The spectacle is enough to feed legend. A great king's troops forced again and again against a narrow human barrier, but such barriers survive only while they remain barriers. A local man, Ephialtes, reveals a mountain path around the position, and Persian troops move behind the defenders. Once news of the encirclement reaches Leonidas, much of the Greek force departs, whether he orders their withdrawal to preserve them, whether contingents decide according to obligation and circumstance, or whether several motives combine. The final stand becomes unavoidable for those who remain. The last hours have been polished by centuries of admiration, but the physical reality is stark. Spears break, men fight at shorter range, Leonidas is killed, and fighting erupts over his body. The survivors retreat toward a low hill, exposed and surrounded. Persian archers release missiles until resistance ends. Long afterward, bronze arrowheads found on the hill give material weight to the scene, preserved by literature, not a romantic tableau. But a small area into which death descended in volleys. Thermopylae is a Persian victory. The road south opens, Greek cities that resist are exposed. Athens itself will soon be evacuated and burned. Yet defeat becomes one of the most powerful stories the Greeks possess, because those who died in the past seem to turn obedience to law and community into something stronger than survival. The moral brightness of Thermopylae can conceal its grim companions. Men who withdraw carry the knowledge that others remain behind to die. Communities must decide whether to resist, submit, or watch which side gains the advantage. Thebes, Thespiae, Plataea, Athens, Sparta, and the island powers do not experience the invasion in identical ways. Greek unity is real when it matters most, but fragile and incomplete. Persia does not march into a simple country called Greece. It enters a landscape of rival states, old suspicions, local interests, and uneasy alliances, some willing to resist and some willing or forced to cooperate with the invader. A battlefield legend may make the lines appear clean. Life beyond the monument rarely is. After Thermopylae, the war moves toward the sea. Athens is abandoned by much of its population before Persian forces arrive, its people transported to safety while their city is occupied and burned. To lose streets, homes, temples, graves, and sacred ground without knowing whether return will ever be possible is a different form of battlefield terror, one suffered by those who never hold a spear. The Athenian commander Themistocles has long understood that ships may matter more than walls. Near Salamis, in narrow waters where the greater Persian fleet cannot easily exploit its size, the Greek ships meet the imperial navy. The combat is not clean or distant. Wooden hulls ram and splinter, oars snap, marines fight across decks, men thrown into the sea drown beneath armour, wreckage, confusion, and the pressure of vessels still trying to manoeuvre. The shoreward waters become filled with damaged ships and bodies, Xerxes watching from a vantage point. Sees not a simple imperial display, but a fleet crowded into defeat. Salamis does not destroy the Persian Empire. It does not even immediately remove Persian land forces from Greece, but it changes the invasion's possibilities. Xerxes returns east with much of his force, while Mardonius remains with a selected army to continue the campaign. The following year, in 479 before the Common Era, the final decisive land confrontation comes near Plataea. Here the Greek coalition gathers in strength, including Spartans, Athenians, Corinthians, and others who understand that a restored Persian offensive could make every earlier sacrifice meaningless. The armies maneuver for days in a landscape shaped by water access, supply difficulties, cavalry harassment, and mutual caution. Ancient battles are often won before the decisive collision by hunger, thirst, nerves, misunderstanding, and the exhaustion of maintaining a position under threat. The Greek line begins a difficult night movement after Persian pressure has made its position increasingly hazardous. The maneuver does not unfold neatly. Forces become separated. Orders do not produce perfect coordination. Mardonius sees what appears to be a retreat and presses forward. The encounter that follows is savage. Persian troops fight with courage and discipline, but once combat closes against Greek heavy infantry, their position becomes dangerous. Mardonius is killed. His death matters not because one life alone decides thousands, but because battle is partly confidence, and the fall of the commanding figure can tear a hole through the willingness of others to remain. The Persian force breaks toward its fortified camp. Once the Greeks penetrate the defences, slaughter follows among men crowded into a refuge that no longer protects them. Herodotus presents losses on a monumental scale, with very few Persians surviving from a vast army. Modern judgment is far more cautious, yet even stripped of impossible precision, Plataea is plainly a killing ground. Thousands die in the defeat, pursuit, and capture of the camp. The invasion of mainland Greece is broken. From Marathon to Plataea, the Greek victories acquire meanings that far exceed the men buried after each fight. They become proof of courage, civic freedom, Spartan discipline, Athenian sea power, divine favour, and the superiority of those who resisted. Much of that legacy is understandable. Communities that narrowly escape conquest naturally remember the days on which survival turned. But the Persians are too easily transformed into scenery for Greek heroism, into unthinking numbers waiting to fall beneath spear or ram. They were men drawn from the immense reach of an empire, speaking different languages, serving different obligations, marching and sailing through foreign terrain, suffering wounds and fear just as the Greeks did. Their dead are counted by enemies and mostly denied individual memory. These battles stand among the most famous in antiquity, not because their casualty figures can be accepted without doubt, but because they reveal how bloodshed becomes identity. Athens remembers Marathon and Salamis as moments when its citizens saved more than their city. Sparta remembers Thermopylae as perfect obedience carried to death. The wider Greek world remembers Plataea as deliverance. In the telling, immense losses make the victory greater, while heroic sacrifice makes defeat bearable. Yet the earth beneath those stories remains less selective. Beneath a burial mound, on an arrow-strewn hill, among drowned sailors and men killed beside a captured camp, glory ends the same way it did at Tolence and Kadesh, as bodies abandoned to survivors, and silence waiting for someone to decide what their deaths will mean. The fields of Marathon and Plataea could be remembered as places where Greek communities stood against an invader and survived. That memory carried a dangerous comfort. It suggested that shared danger had revealed a common cause, that the burning of Athens and the dead at Thermopylae had bound the Greek world together. But triumph did not remove rivalry, it enlarged it. Athens emerged from the Persian wars with ships, prestige, and an alliance whose treasury and obedience increasingly served Athenian power. Sparta remained the dominant land force, watching as the city it had fought beside became the centre of an expanding maritime empire. Persia had threatened Greece from outside. The bloodiest wound of the classical Greek world would be opened from within. The conflict later called the Peloponnesian War begins in 431 before the Common Era, but its pressures have been forming for decades. Athens leads what began as a defensive league against Persia, collecting ships or money from allied cities across the Aegean. Over time, attempts to leave the alliance as oppressed. Tribute becomes a sign of subordination, and Athenian strength rises from the contributions of communities that no longer behave as free partners. Sparta presides over its own alliance of land powers and fears the rapid growth of Athenian influence. Thucydides, the Athenian general and historian who becomes the war's most severe witness, identifies that fear as the deepest cause. States may enter disaster not because one grievance makes it inevitable, but because power shifts until restraint appears more dangerous than war. When Spartan-led armies invade Attica, countryside suffers first. Farms, vines, olive trees, rural buildings, and the stored labour of families become targets. Athens does not attempt to defeat Spartan hoplites in open battle. Guided by the strategy associated with Pericles, Athenians bring the rural population behind the long walls connecting city to port, relying on their navy and maritime supplies. Militarily, it has logic. Emotionally, it is corrosive. Men watch smoke rise from inherited land while being told that preserving ships matters more than defending soil. Farmers crowd into urban spaces, shrines, and makeshift shelters in a city not built to receive them. War is no longer just the line of shields where spears strike. It is displacement, heat, refuse, anxiety, and resentment pressed inside stone walls. Then the crowded city becomes a killing ground without an enemy entering it. In 430, disease arrives in Athens, likely through the harbour connections upon which the city's strategy depends. Thucydides describes its effects because he suffers it and survives fever, thirst, bodily distress, despair, people dying in numbers that overwhelm burial and care. The exact disease remains debated. No single identification fully accounts for the ancient description. What matters in the war is the devastation. Athens loses a substantial part of its population, including soldiers, sailors, civilians, and eventually Pericles himself. No spear formation could have produced such indiscriminate terror so quickly. The fleet still exists, the walls remain, but strategy has invited concentration, and concentration has turned disease into an ally of war. The war spreads through raids, naval clashes, sieges, revolts, massacres, and uneasy truces. At Plataea, the small city once honoured for standing beside Athens at Marathon is besieged by Spartans and Thebans. Starved into surrender, many male defenders are executed, women are enslaved, and the city is destroyed. The old unity against Persia has become cruelly irrelevant. On Corcyra, civil conflict linked to the larger war descends into factional killing. Democrats and oligarchs murder opponents not simply as military threats, but as fellow citizens reclassified as enemies. Temples offer little safety. Personal grudges hide beneath political allegiance. Thucydides sees a pattern that war carries from city to city, recklessness praised as courage, moderation treated as cowardice, cruelty justified as necessity. The bloodiest battles are not always those with the greatest heap of corpses at sunset. Sometimes they are wars that teach neighbours to see murder as policy. Athens is capable of both resilience and coldness. At Pylos and Sphacteria, it shocks the Greek world by capturing Spartan hoplites alive, including men from the elite citizen body whose reputation depended upon a willingness to die rather than surrender. Spartan warriors can be trapped, starved, and made to yield like other men. Yet Athenian fortune does not settle the struggle. At Amphipolis, the Spartan commander Brasidas and the Athenian Cleon are both killed, and peace follows in 421. Named after the cautious Athenian Nicias, it is less an ending than an exhausted pause. Allies distrust it. Old grievances remain. Too many ambitions survive the graves. During this uneasy interval, Athens turns its power against the small neutral island of Melos. The island has attempted to avoid submission to Athenian rule. In the account shaped by Thucydides, Athenian representatives make the logic of power plain justice is meaningful only where forces are equal. The strong act as they can, and the weak endure what they must. The reported dialogue is not a transcript, but its outcome is real enough. Melos resists. Athens captures it, kills the adult men, and enslaves the women and children. There is no great tactical marvel here, no narrow pass or brilliant manoeuvre, only a community crushed because a powerful city decides that independence would advertise weakness. The same Athens whose dead at Marathon embody resistance to domination now imposes annihilation upon those who refuse its command. Almost immediately, ambition turns westward. Sicily is rich, distant, politically divided, and tempting. Athenian allies there appeal for help against Syracuse and its partners, but the response grows beyond limited support into a vast expedition. Nicias, sceptical of the undertaking, warns of its costs, hoping its demands will discourage the city. Instead, his warning inflames enthusiasm. In 415, the fleet departs from the Piraeus in a spectacle of confidence warships, soldiers, rowers, marines, supplies, commanders, families at the water's edge. Prayers offered as an expedition unlike any earlier Athenian venture sets out towards Sicily. Many watching the ships leave will never see the men aboard them return. The command is divided among Nicias, the brilliant and dangerously ambitious Alcibiades, and Lamachus. Before the campaign can find direction, Alcibiades is recalled to face accusations connected with religious scandals that erupted before departure. He escapes and eventually advises Sparta against his own city. The expedition begins to suffer from delay, divided purpose, and the absence of decisive action. Syracuse is not helpless. Its citizens have walls, cavalry, knowledge of terrain, political determination, and time to understand the danger. Athens has sent a formidable force far from its own bases into a campaign where every delay consumes food, health, morale, and opportunity. At first, the Athenians threaten Syracuse seriously. They attempt to encircle the city with siege walls, a race of construction and obstruction in which stone lines decide whether Syracuse will be isolated or remain connected to aid. Fighting is also labour under danger. Men hauling blocks and digging while cavalry raids and missiles fall. Lamachus is killed. Nicias, already sick, is left with command. Then the Spartan Gylippus arrives and helps stiffen resistance, organising counterworks that prevent complete encirclement. A campaign Athens expected to dominate hardens into a trap of its own making. Reinforcements arrive under Demosthenes, adding thousands more men to the danger rather than reversing it. Recognising that delay favours Syracuse, he attempts a bold night assault on the high ground at Epipolae. Initial success dissolves in darkness. Units cannot recognise one another. Commands blur. Panic multiplies faster than orders. The attackers are driven back, with men killed or tumbling from steep ground in the retreat. Demosthenes urges withdrawal. Nicias hesitates. Worried about political consequences and perhaps encouraged by reports that Syracuse is strained, when he finally agrees to leave, a lunar eclipse occurs. Interpreted as an omen requiring delay, it holds the army in place. Ancient commanders do not operate outside the beliefs of their society, and an army frightened by signs in the heavens cannot simply be treated as a machine indifferent to divine warning. The delay is fatal. Syracuse seals the harbour. The Athenians, once masters of naval war, must fight in waters crowded with vessels, wreckage, missiles, shouting crews, and ships unable to manoeuvre freely. Their last attempt to break out becomes a brutal floating struggle watched from shore by men whose entire chance of escape depends upon the ships before them. When the fleet fails, the army is stranded, ships, equipment, wounded men, and the dead are left behind as survivors begin a retreat inland. Seeking safety and movement, their hope is already shrinking. The retreat is one of antiquity's most harrowing collapses. Men move hungry, thirsty, exhausted, burdened by wounds and shadowed by Syracusan cavalry and light troops. Those unable to continue are abandoned. Demosthenes' force is surrounded and compelled to surrender. Nicias presses on until his desperate soldiers reach the Asinarus River. Discipline disintegrates at the sight of water. Men rush down to drink, crowding and trampling one another while missiles strike into the mass and enemies descend upon them. The river turns foul with mud, blood, and bodies, yet the living continue drinking because thirst has become stronger than terror. It is not a battle in the heroic form Greece learned to praise. It is the destruction of an army that no longer possesses room, order, or choice. Nicias and Demosthenes surrender and are executed. Many prisoners are confined in the stone quarries of Syracuse, exposed to heat by day, cold by night, hunger, disease, and the decay of men dying beside them. Some are sold into slavery, many vanish there. Of the magnificent expedition that left Athens, only pitiful remnants find their way home. Exact losses cannot be recovered with confidence, but the scale of the disaster is beyond dispute. Ships lost, crews destroyed, infantry dead or captive, money consumed, prestige shattered, and allies suddenly aware that the empire can bleed. The war continues for years after Sicily. Persia shifts the balance by supporting Sparta financially. Athenian allies revolt. Athens suffers political upheaval and still raises new fleets with almost unbelievable endurance. Finally, at Aegospotami, in 405, the Spartan commander Lysander captures or destroys nearly the entire Athenian fleet in a sudden disaster. Without ships, grain routes, or imperial income, Athens surrenders. Its walls are pulled down, its empire is gone. The city itself is not exterminated, partly because even its enemies remember what Athens once did against Persia. Memory, which had fed rivalry, now helps limit revenge. No single afternoon contains the full bloodshed of the Peloponnesian War. Its horror lies in accumulation plague behind walls, men executed after surrender, civilians enslaved, cities divided against themselves, islanders annihilated, sailors drowned in a foreign harbour, prisoners dying in quarries, farms burned year after year, and a generation taught that survival may require acts it once would have called shameful. Greece resisted the largest empire it knew and told itself a story about freedom. Then, over nearly 3 decades, its cities demonstrated how much ruin free communities could willingly inflict upon one another. The dead in Sicily mark more than a failed expedition. They mark the moment Athenian confidence falls into its own reflection and sees beneath the brilliance of ships, speeches, and stone the destruction its power has learned to make. When Athens finally falls, the Greek world is not made whole again. Sparta wins the war, but victory does not restore the confidence of the age before plague, massacre, and the catastrophe in Sicily. The old balance has been burned away. Cities remain suspicious, exhausted, ambitious, vulnerable to Persian money and to one another. Sparta's supremacy proves harsh and brief. Thebes rises, then struggles to hold what it has gained. Athens rebuilds enough of its influence to matter again, but never recovers the unquestioned command it once possessed across the sea. Decades of war have shown that the independent city-states can produce extraordinary soldiers, sailors, and statesmen, but they cannot stop competing long enough to prevent someone else from mastering them. From the north, beyond the traditional centres of Greek prestige, a kingdom once dismissed by many southern Greeks as rough and peripheral begins learning exactly how to use their divisions. Macedon is not created by Philip II, but under him it becomes something profoundly more dangerous than its enemies expect. When Philip takes the throne in 359 before the Common Era, his kingdom is threatened by rivals, neighbouring peoples, and internal instability. He responds not with one fortunate campaign, but with sustained reform. Macedonian infantry carry the sarissa, a pike far longer than the spear of the classical hoplite, requiring drill, cohesion, and mutual dependence. A man in the front ranks is protected and made lethal by ranks behind him. A disorderly phalanx becomes vulnerable, but a disciplined one advances like a moving wall of points. Philip combines it with elite infantry, light troops, siege engineering, diplomacy, bribery, marriage alliances, and powerful cavalry led by nobles bound closely to the king. The army is no longer simply a citizen body answering a seasonal call. It is an instrument sharpened through continuous campaigning and directed by royal ambition. In 338 at Cheronea, Macedon confronts the leading Greek coalition opposing Philip's expansion. Athens and Thebes stand among the central forces of resistance. The old rivals, now brought together by a danger neither can handle alone. The battle is remembered partly because a young Alexander, Philip's son, commands cavalry or a key striking force in the Macedonian line. The exact maneuvers remain debated, but the result is clear. The Greek coalition is defeated, the Theban sacred band, sacred. The famed elite formation, celebrated for its discipline and courage, is virtually annihilated where it stands. Later tradition tells of Philip weeping when he sees their bodies, perhaps an attempt to preserve dignity on both sides of a battle that ends the independent military dominance of the southern Greek cities. Whether the gesture happened as told cannot be proven. The bodies themselves required no literary ornament. More than 250 members of the sacred band appear to have died together, and the lion monument raised at Cheronea marks not a glorious rescue, but the burial place of an order that could fight superbly and still be destroyed. Philip does not smash Greece into ruins. He does something more useful. Through the League of Corinth, he binds most Greek states into a settlement under Macedonian leadership and prepares a campaign against Persia, presenting it in part as vengeance for the invasions of generations earlier. This appeal to memory is politically brilliant. The burned temples and heroic battles of the Persian wars can now be used to place Greek manpower behind Macedonian command. But Philip never leads that invasion. In 336, he is assassinated at Aegae during royal celebrations, killed before the assembled court by a bodyguard whose motives remain contested within a web of personal grievance and political suspicion. His son Alexander inherits a kingdom, an army, and a project not yet tested against the greatest empire in the known world. Alexander is about 20 years old, and the speed with which he secures his position is as ruthless as it is effective. Rival claimants are eliminated, rebellions are suppressed. When Thebes revolts in 335, encouraged by rumours that Alexander has died on campaign, he moves with shocking speed to the city. The assault ends not in negotiated chastisement, but in destruction. Thousands of Thebans are killed, many more sold into slavery, and much of the city is levelled. With limited symbolic exceptions, including temples and, in tradition, the house associated with the poet Pindar. The lesson is unmistakable. Before Alexander crosses into Asia, he makes clear what resistance behind him will cost. The massacre at Thebes is often treated as a preface to his conquests, but for the families killed or enslaved there, it is not a preface. It is the entire apocalypse. In 334, the Macedonian king crosses the Hellespont into Asia with an army relatively small compared with the immense territories he seeks to challenge, perhaps around 30 to 40,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry. Though exact totals vary among ancient sources and modern reconstructions, he visits Troy and links his campaign to heroic memory, presenting himself in the landscape of Achilles while carrying a force built less upon epic rage than upon Philip's hard innovations. This army can march quickly, maintain formations, combine infantry and cavalry at decisive moments, conduct sieges, and follow a commander whose willingness to risk himself in battle strengthens loyalty even as it exposes the entire enterprise to the possibility of sudden collapse. The first major encounter comes at the Granicus River. Persian satrapal forces gather on the far bank, including cavalry and Greek mercenary infantry in Persian service. Ancient accounts disagree about important features of the battle, including timing and sequence, but they agree on Alexander's aggressive attack and personal danger. Macedonian cavalry enters the river under missile and cavalry pressure, struggling up the bank into close combat. Alexander's helmet is struck. A blow nearly kills him before a companion intervenes. Here the legend and the physical truth meet. A king commanding the conquest of Asia can be ended by a blade in a muddy river fight before his empire begins. The Persian cavalry is driven back. The Greek mercenaries, left exposed, suffer terribly. Many are killed, others are captured and sent in chains to Macedonia, treated by Alexander as traitors for fighting on behalf of Persia against the supposed common cause of the Greeks. His war of liberation contains coercion from the start. Victory at the Granicus opens Western Asia Minor, but cities do not all respond alike. Some receive Alexander as a liberator from Persian control, others resist or become sites of factional struggle. At Miletus and Halicarnassus, military operations show that the campaign will require siegecraft as much as battlefield brilliance. Behind every celebrated cavalry charge stand engineers, labourers, ships, stores, wounded men, and civilians trapped within places the advancing army cannot simply ignore. Alexander moves along the coast to reduce the Persian fleet's access to ports, a strategic method that replaces direct naval confrontation with the capture of shore bases. Already, conquest is changing landscapes town by town, not only on famous fields. The Persian king Darius III now gathers a royal army to stop the invasion. In 333, the opposing forces encounter one another near Issus, where the terrain compresses the battle between mountains and sea. The setting matters enormously. Persian numerical superiority, whatever its real extent, cannot be fully spread across the narrow coastal plain. Darius has moved behind Alexander's position, cutting across his communication route and reportedly finding Macedonians sick and wounded left at Issus, who are killed or mutilated in the brutality preceding the greater clash. Alexander turns back. Two kings are now close enough to see the stakes embodied in each other. The Pinarus River divides the armies. Persian troops prepare along its bank, with Greek mercenaries in the centre facing the Macedonian phalanx, and cavalry deployed where terrain permits. Alexander leads the companion cavalry on the right. The phalanx moves through difficult ground and across the stream, its alignment disrupted as it meets resistance. In the centre, Persian-employed Greek infantry fights fiercely against Macedonians and Greeks under Macedonian command. This is not simply Europe against Asia, however later images may frame it. Greeks kill Greeks in the service of two imperial visions. The Macedonian centre comes under serious pressure. Long pikes are formidable when aligned, broken by riverbanks and hard fighting. Their formation open spaces where trained enemies can inflict heavy wounds. On the right, Alexander's charge breaks through opposing forces and wheels toward the centre and toward Darius himself. The surviving accounts emphasise the moment when the Persian king sees danger approaching and leaves the field in his chariot, later abandoning it as flight continues. Ancient writers shape this scene around the contrast they desire, Alexander advancing into danger, Darius turning away. Yet a king's withdrawal from a collapsing position is not necessarily simple cowardice. His survival preserves the possibility of further armies and resistance across an empire. On the field, however, royal flight is devastating. Once men believe their king and centre are lost, organised resistance begins to unravel. The constricted terrain that had hindered Persia now makes retreat more murderous. Men crowd together, stumble over the fallen, and are struck from behind as Macedonian forces push into the breakdown. The casualty figures given by ancient sources soar into the tens or even hundreds of thousands for Persian losses, numbers that modern historians treat with deep scepticism. Victory narratives magnify the heaps of enemy dead, and armies of the scale sometimes claimed would have posed immense logistical difficulties. Yet scepticism about numbers should not soften the killing itself. Issus ends with a rifted army pressed through narrow terrain, a royal camp seized, and countless bodies on roads and approaches where flight fails. Macedonian losses are presented as comparatively slight, as victors often present them, though the fierce resistance in the centre strongly suggests that the triumph carried a real price. Within the captured Persian camp, Alexander takes possession not of Darius, but of Darius's family, his mother, wife, and children. Tradition emphasises Alexander's respectful treatment of them, a detail repeatedly used to present him as magnanimous in victory, yet their capture is also the political cruelty of defeat made intimate. The royal family becomes evidence that the Persian king failed to protect those closest to him. Darius offers negotiations, territory, ransom. An alliance in different stages of the campaign according to the sources. Alexander refuses to settle for a share of empire. After Issus, he is no longer merely raiding Persia or liberating Greek cities. He is reaching for Darius's kingship itself. Rather than pursue Darius immediately into the interior, Alexander moves down the eastern Mediterranean coast. He needs to deny the Persian fleet its bases, secure his rear, and prevent resistance from gathering behind him. Many cities submit. Tyre does not. The ancient island city, heavily fortified offshore and proud of its security, offers limited cooperation but refuses the full access Alexander demands. The resulting siege in 332 lasts months and reveals a dimension of conquest more terrible than victory in open battle. Alexander's army constructs a causeway through the water toward the island. Using rubble and material from the older mainland settlement, Tyrian defenders attack the works with fireships and missiles. Siege towers burn, engineers adapt, ships eventually assist the assault. Both sides understand that surrender and storming will not lead to the same fate, which gives defenders reason to fight with desperation, and besiegers reason to grow more punitive with every delay. When the city finally falls, the punishment is savage. Ancient accounts report thousands killed in the assault and aftermath, with large numbers sold into slavery. Some defenders are said to have been crucified along the shore, though details and totals vary by source. The image is difficult to reconcile with a cultivated portrait of the noble conqueror protecting Darius's family. But conquest does not require consistency of mercy. Alexander can treat royal captives generously when it enhances his claim to kingship, and destroy a resisting city when terror serves strategy. At Gaza, after another hard siege, violence again follows capture, and later stories about the treatment of its commander may carry literary shaping, but the broader reality is clear cities that force the Macedonian army to pay for entry can expect catastrophe once their walls fail. Egypt welcomes Alexander with little recorded resistance, and there he is recognised as ruler, founds Alexandria, and travels to the oracle at Siwa, adding layers of divine legitimacy to his evolving identity. But Darius remains alive. The Persian heartland remains unconquered, and both kings know that another decisive encounter is coming. Alexander marches out of Egypt and deeper into Asia, beyond the coastal world where ships and ports shaped his strategy. Darius gathers a new army on broad terrain chosen to avoid the compression that crippled him at Issus. The ground is prepared for chariots. Forces from across the empire assemble. The confrontation at Gaugamela in 331 will be remembered as the battle that breaks the central power of Achaemenid Persia, though even there the empire will not die cleanly in one day. The plain near Gaugamela offers Darius room. His army includes cavalry from eastern regions renowned for horsemanship, infantry, Greek mercenaries, scythed chariots designed to disrupt the Macedonian formation, and perhaps elephants. Though their tactical role is unclear, ancient claims concerning the size of his host are enormous and unreliable. But the force is unquestionably substantial and deliberately assembled for decision. Alexander faces not an ambush, not a narrow river valley, but an enemy prepared on favourable ground. The night before battle, his officers are said to have suggested a surprise attack under darkness. Alexander rejects it, later tradition giving him the magnificent line that he will not steal a victory, whether spoken or fashioned afterward, The story captures how his image is being constructed not just as a successful commander, but as a man entitled to defeat the great king openly beneath the gaze of the world. At dawn, the Macedonian formation advances obliquely, drawing Persian forces and threatening to move beyond the ground, specially cleared for chariots. Darius must respond. Persian cavalry attacks on the wings. Scythed chariots rush toward the Macedonian line, terrifying in appearance, though trained troops can open lanes, strike drivers and horses with missiles, and reduce their effect when discipline holds. The fighting spreads across a huge field, and its most important moments do not occur in a single neat collision. On one wing, Macedonian and allied cavalry are hard-pressed. Baggage areas are threatened or penetrated. Confusion reaches behind the formal battle line. But as Persian movements create an opening toward the centre, Alexander forms a striking wedge with the companion cavalry and drives toward Darius. Once again, the Persian king leaves the battlefield as the Macedonian threat closes. Once again, that flight becomes the central image of defeat. Yet Alexander cannot simply pursue without restraint, because elsewhere his own forces are struggling. Parmenion on the Macedonian left faces intense pressure and calls for help according to the narrative tradition. Alexander turns from the chase or delays it to stabilise the wider battle. This detail matters because it reveals the thin line beneath apparent inevitability. Even at Gaugamela, the battle that later makes Alexander seem unstoppable, parts of his army are in severe danger. His victory depends upon a system that bends without breaking long enough for his decisive charge to tear apart the enemy's centre. Darius escapes, but his authority does not recover. Babylon and Susa fall to Alexander. Persepolis, ceremonial heart of Persian kingship, is occupied, its treasures seized, and its palace complex later burned. The burning is variously explained as a deliberate act of vengeance for Persian destruction in Greece, a drunken impulse encouraged during celebration, or a political gesture marking the end of the old royal order. Scholars still debate intention. The fire itself is beyond debate. Columns, halls, reliefs, and storied spaces of empire are caught in the conqueror's destruction, while Macedonian rule begins taking possession of Persian power even as it claims to avenge Greek wrongs. Darius flees eastward and is eventually seized by his own associates as Alexander pursues. When the Macedonians finally find him, he has been mortally wounded and abandoned. Alexander now treats the dead king with honour and punishes those responsible, presenting himself not as the destroyer of Persian kingship but as its legitimate successor. The war does not end, it changes shape. Campaigns in Central Asia become bitter, prolonged, and less suited to glorious set-piece memory. Resistance emerges through mobile warfare, local strongholds, revolts, and political distrust. Alexander responds with sieges, executions, forced movements, marriages, new settlements, and increasing adoption of elements of Persian monarchy that trouble some of his Macedonian companions. The man who began as leader of a Greek revenge war becomes ruler over the empire he defeated, demanding obedience from people who once expected to share conquest rather than bow within it. His advance into India carries the army into another cycle of battle and exhaustion. At the Hydaspes River in 326, he faces King Porus, whose war elephants create fear and disorder among troops, unused to confronting such animals at close quarters. Alexander wins after a difficult river crossing and fierce battle, then restores Porus as a subordinate ruler, admiring the opponent whose resistance makes victory worthy of memory. But beyond lies more war, larger reported armies, unfamiliar rivers, monsoon rains, and men who have followed conquest farther than any reasonable limit. At the Hyphasis, his soldiers refuse to continue east. The army that has broken kingdoms finally draws a boundary its king cannot cross by will alone. The return is not a peaceful release. Campaigns continue. Cities resisting along the route are attacked, during an assault among the Malians. Alexander leaps into a fortified position with too few companions, and is struck by an arrow that penetrates his chest. For a time, the army believes he may die. Men rage against the city in retaliation. The moment echoes Granicus. The extraordinary enterprise repeatedly hangs upon one body, that its owner exposes with almost reckless determination. He survives the wound, but thousands will not survive the later march through the Gedrosian desert, where heat, thirst, hunger, exhaustion, and failed provisioning kill soldiers and followers in a disaster whose precise motive remains unclear. It may have been chosen to secure coastal routes, to emulate or surpass earlier legendary expeditions, or through a ruinous confidence that underestimated the land. No enemy formation is needed. An army victorious from Greece to India can be consumed by sand and thirst under its own commander's decision. Alexander reaches Babylon and dies there in 323, not yet 33 years old. The cause remains uncertain. Fever from natural illness is generally more plausible than later suspicions of poisoning. Though the absence of decisive evidence ensures speculation endures, he leaves no adult heir able to command the world he has taken. His generals and successors divide, bargain, murder, and go to war across the vast territories created by his campaigns. His body itself becomes a political prize. The empire won at such cost does not pass intact into a stable future. It becomes a battlefield for men who learned empire under a king who never taught them how it might survive him. The road from Cheronea to Babylon is filled with names that shine in military history: Granicus, Issus, Tyre, Gaugamela, Hydaspes. Behind each stands a denser accounting: sacred band fighters lying dead beside their vanished independents, Theban families killed or enslaved to secure a young king's rear, Greek mercenaries cut down for choosing the wrong employer, Persian soldiers pursued through constricted ground, Tyrians dying inside a city whose defiance had lasted too long, Macedonians buried far from home or left somewhere along roads that led continually east, Indians facing pikes and cavalry beside elephants driven into pain and panic, followers collapsing in the desert after the battles had supposedly been won. The numbers given by ancient writers are often shaped by admiration, hostility, and the need to make conquest vast enough for its conqueror. But no correction of exaggerated totals transforms Alexander's campaigns into something clean. He changes the ancient world. Greek language and institutions spread across regions newly tied into Hellenistic kingdoms. Cities are founded or refounded, trade, scholarship, political forms, artistic styles, and religious encounters take new paths. Alexandria in Egypt will become one of the greatest centres of the Mediterranean world, yet transformation travels with devastation. Alexander's genius lies partly in recognising where a battle can be broken open. His terror lies in what follows when resistance stands between him and the horizon. At Megiddo, victory allowed a king to extend authority. At Kadesh, a king turned near disaster into heroic memory. In the Persian Wars, Greek communities shaped survival into identity. Under Alexander, battle becomes motion without rest, a chain of victories so swift and dazzling that the dead behind the advance almost vanish beneath the legend of the man riding at its front. Alexander's army turns back from India, but the lands beyond the Indus do not return to the shape they had before his arrival. His invasion has shaken rulers, damaged some communities, rearranged alliances, and exposed the vulnerability of territories divided among competing powers. In the northwestern regions, Macedonian officials and successor commanders struggle to hold what conquest has touched only briefly. Farther east, beyond the limits Alexander ever reaches. Another power is rising from the Gangetic world with an ambition no less formidable. The Mauryan Empire will not be built through one heroic charge or one famous river crossing. It grows through political upheaval, administration, taxation, fortified centres, roads, officers, spies, garrisons, elephants, infantry, cavalry, and the difficult capacity to bind enormous and varied territories to a single ruling house. By the time Ashoka inherits that empire, he commands one of the most extensive states ancient South Asia has yet seen. Then, after a victorious war on its eastern edge, the language of conquest suddenly changes. For once, an ancient ruler does not carve into stone only what he has gained. He announces, across his own empires, what his victory has cost. The beginnings of the Mauryan state are wrapped in a mixture of historical memory and later tradition. Chandragupta. Maurya emerges in the aftermath of Alexander's campaigns and establishes control over Magadha, the rich political heartland of the Lower Ganges region, displacing the earlier Nanda dynasty. From there, his authority expands. In the northwest, he confronts Seleucus I, one of the successor rulers dividing Alexander's inheritance. The details of their conflict are not preserved as a full battlefield narrative, but the settlement matters. Mauryan control extends into territories once touched by Macedonian conquest, while diplomatic exchange and a marriage arrangement, or alliance remembered as one, accompany a transfer of war elephants to Seleucus. Those elephants later appear far to the west in successor warfare, living evidence of how campaigns in India have become connected to the struggles of the Hellenistic world. Chandragupta's son Bindusara maintains and possibly expands the realm, and Ashoka eventually succeeds him after a succession whose violence is described dramatically in later Buddhist accounts, but cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Legends of brothers murdered and a cruel prince transformed into a righteous ruler have shaped Ashoka's memory for centuries. They may preserve an awareness that his accession was contested and harsh, but they are not contemporary records. The most secure voice Ashoka leaves is his own official voice in inscriptions cut into stone across a vast geographical span. There he commonly identifies himself by royal titles rather than by the personal name. Later, history makes famous a king favoured by the gods, a ruler concerned with moral conduct, order, welfare, restraint, and obedience. That voice only becomes possible because he already possesses the machinery of power. His compassion is proclaimed from the throne of an empire built and maintained by force. To the southeast lies Kalinga, broadly associated with the coastal region of present-day Odisha and adjacent areas. It is not an empty gap awaiting absorption into a natural empire. It is a politically independent land with access to routes, resources, fertile areas, coastal movement, and communities beyond direct Mauryan control. Why Ashoka chooses to conquer it is not explained in a campaign diary. Its strategic position along the eastern coast may have mattered. Its independence within reach of a powerful imperial centre may itself have been unacceptable. Great states often describe expansion as necessity only after choosing to make a neighbour's freedom inconvenient. Whatever the immediate cause, Ashoka's own inscription dates the conquest to the 8th year after his consecration, commonly placed around 261 before the Common Era. Unlike Kadesh or Gaugamela, the Kalinga War leaves no surviving narrative of formations on a field, no detailed movement of elephants and infantry, no preserved account of a king narrowly escaping disaster or breaking an enemy centre. The landscape of fighting is not securely recovered as one decisive battlefield. Later associations gather around places such as Dowley and the River Daya. But the dramatic picture sometimes imagined of a single river running red cannot simply be treated as established fact. Kalinga may have suffered battle, siege, pursuit, occupation, forced removal, and the wider violence required to subdue a region rather than one neat encounter decided in a day, this absence of tactical detail makes the war more unsettling. Its memory does not survive because a commander admired a clever maneuver. It survives because the conqueror himself places the suffering at the centre of what victory means. In the 13th of Ashoka's major rock edicts, the numbers appear with a directness rarely encountered in ancient royal celebration. After Kalinga was conquered, 150,000 people were carried away or deported. 100,000 were killed. Many times that number died afterward. Even allowing for the grave difficulty of treating royal figures as precise demographic accounting, these are staggering claims. The inscription does not present them as the deaths of a hostile army alone. It directs attention to the pain inflicted upon a conquered country religious people, householders, families, friends, dependents, those killed, those separated from loved ones, and even those who survive while suffering the losses of others. The violence has escaped the battlefield and entered the social fabric. A man may survive the invasion and still lose parents, children, companions, teachers, servants, neighbours, and the familiar structure of his life. Here, in an emperor's own message, conquest is measured not only in corpses but in severed relationships. That is the detail that makes Kalinga different from nearly every earlier royal war memory in this story. Narmer's enemies are arranged beneath him. Thutmose III records the route to Megiddo and the abundance of captured goods. Rameses II converts danger into divine heroism. Greek historians preserve the courage of their own communities and the multitudes they claim to defeat. Alexander's victories become stages in the making of a world conqueror. Ashoka also speaks as a victor. No one should forget that Kalinga has been taken, his imperial authority remains in place, the inscription is issued from above after resistance has failed. Yet he does something unusual enough to remain startling. More than 2,000 years later, he records that the act of conquering an independent country brings him remorse. It is tempting to turn this into a simple tale of sudden conversion. A ruthless king surveys a battlefield filled with bodies, is struck by grief, embraces Buddhism in one transforming instant, and renounces violence forever. Later religious traditions helped give that story its memorable form, and it remains powerful because human beings want to believe that even an emperor can be stopped by the sight of suffering he caused. The historical reality is more complicated. Ashoka's relationship to Buddhist teachings may have developed before or alongside the aftermath of Kalinga, rather than beginning in one dramatic moment. His Dhamma, the moral policy proclaimed in his inscriptions, is not merely a command that all subjects become Buddhist. It stresses ethical behaviour, restraint, respect toward parents and teachers, proper treatment of servants and dependents, regard for religious communities, moderation in killing animals, and a royal concern for welfare and harmony. The conquest of Kalinga is presented as a profound reason for his intensified commitment to this moral order, but not as a clean modern biography in which one battle instantly creates an entirely different man. Nor does remorse dissolve empire. Ashoka does not restore Kalinga's independence. He does not abolish punishment, dismiss his officials, or abandon the authority that made deportation and slaughter possible. Other edicts reveal a ruler still prepared to warn forest peoples beyond settled control that, although he desires restraint, he possesses the power to punish if necessary. This is not pacifism in the absolute sense. It is an emperor attempting to redefine the finest form of victory as conquest through Dhamma, rather than through the sword, while still governing a vast state whose borders and obedience remain backed by force. His moral transformation may be genuine without being complete, and his political program may be humane in aspiration without freeing itself from the structure of imperial command. Even the geography of his remorse carries an unexpected contradiction. Versions of the major rock edicts are placed in many parts of Ashoka's realm, spreading his message across distances and languages, yet at sites in Kalinga itself, where the victims and descendants of the conquest would have lived closest to its wounds, the version of the inscription that explicitly describes the slaughter and remorse is replaced by separate messages concerned with administration, justice, and the conduct of officials. Scholars still debate what this omission means. Perhaps a confession of devastation was politically unsuitable in a land newly brought under Mauryan control, where reminding people of the massacre might inflame resentment rather than soothe it. Perhaps the emperor believed the conquered required promises of fair administration more urgently than declarations of his own sorrow. Whatever the reason, the silence is striking. The remorse is broadcast through much of the empire, but not in precisely the same form to the people who had most reason to answer it. And the numbers themselves demand caution. 100,000 slain and 150,000 removed would make Kalinga one of the greatest recorded catastrophes of ancient conquest. The additional claim that many times more died afterward extends the suffering into an almost unimaginable scale, possibly including disease, hunger, displacement, injury, exposure, and the collapse of ordinary support after war. Yet inscriptions are never mere statistical ledgers. An emperor explaining the depth of his remorse has reason to describe the disaster as immense. Just as an emperor celebrating triumph has reason to enlarge enemy losses, there is no independent casualty register against which the statement can be tested. Archaeology has not yet yielded a mass grave or battlefield assemblage that allows the inscription's totals to be confirmed. What survives in the record suggests a terrible conquest and a royal acknowledgement of widespread suffering. Exactly how closely the stated numbers correspond to the dead remains uncertain. But uncertainty does not empty the inscription of value. Even if the numbers are rhetorical, the choice of rhetoric matters. Ashoka could have claimed countless enemies killed because they deserved destruction. He could have enumerated captives and tribute as proof that the gods favoured him. Instead, he frames mass death and deportation as a burden upon the conqueror's conscience. That statement may also serve power, making the king appear morally elevated, capable of compassion across the empire, and uniquely qualified to instruct subjects in right conduct. Ancient rulers rarely separated personal belief from political presentation. Still, propaganda that praises remorse is not the same as propaganda that praises slaughter. It reveals a recognition that a victory can damage the victor's claim to righteousness, unless he accounts for the pain he has caused. For Kalinga, no imperial declaration can reverse the moment soldiers arrive. Towns and settlements would have faced fear, disruption, loss of stores and labour, the taking of captives, the disappearance of relatives, and the imposition of a new authority. Deportation on the scale. Ashoka claims means more than prisoners marched away after combat. It means families divided and communities stripped of people whose skills, labour, memory, and relationships sustained them. Those taken may have been resettled, employed, absorbed into other regions, or lost within the vast machinery of empire. They become part of the conquest's invisible aftermath that lives not ended immediately, but violently detached from place. The Mauryan Empire does not collapse because Ashoka feels remorse. It continues under him for decades, marked by inscriptions, administrative reach, diplomatic awareness of distant Hellenistic rulers, patronage and support connected with Buddhism, and a vision of kingship that tries to make ethical guardianship part of imperial identity. After his death, the empire weakens and eventually fragments. Though it would be far too simple to blame decline upon moral softness or rejection of aggressive war, empires break for many reasons: succession, regional power, fiscal strain, distance, political conflict, and forces not preserved clearly enough for certainty. The old claim that compassion alone ruined Ashoka's empire says more about admiration for conquest than it does about the evidence. Kalinga remains a hinge in the history of ancient bloodshed because it reveals something the previous battlefields rarely allow. At Tollens, the dead have no king's explanation. At Megiddo and Kadesh, rulers preserve victory while obscuring suffering. Among the Persian wars and the campaigns of Alexander, defeat and slaughter are shaped largely through the voices of those who prevailed. Here the conqueror speaks of sorrow. Even while keeping the conquest, he cannot return the dead. Gather the deported back into their homes, or remove the fear that his army carried into Kalinga. He can only carve the recognition that victory, once stripped of banners and royal language, leaves people killed, scattered, bereaved, and altered beyond repair. The stone does not weep, it simply endures, bearing an emperor's admission that the triumph he ordered became too terrible to praise without qualification. That may be Kalinga's most haunting legacy. The battle is almost invisible in its movements, its weapons, its tactical turns, and the names of those who resisted. Yet its human consequence is made enormous by the one man who benefited most from it, in a history filled with kings enlarging their glory through the deaths of others. Ashoka's inscription leaves a rarer and darker monument, the voice of victory discovering, after the killing is finished, that there are conquests no ruler can truly escape. Ashoka's remorse is astonishing because he names the suffering produced by victory. Far to the northeast, in another world of competing states and expanding armies, a different victory leaves a memory without remorse, so immense and so cruel that later generations struggle even to decide how literally it can be believed. There is no emperor announcing that the deaths weigh upon his conscience. There is instead a commander with an enemy army trapped before him, a state determined to remove its strongest rival, and an account written long afterward of prisoners killed in numbers almost beyond comprehension. The place is Changping. The year is traditionally given as 260 before the Common Era. The struggle between Qin and Zhao has already consumed years, supplies, and thousands of lives before its most terrible act begins. China in the Warring States period is not a single empire temporarily divided by quarrelling rulers. It is a landscape of increasingly centralized, aggressively organized states whose survival depends upon taxation, grain, conscription, fortifications, law, diplomacy, agricultural expansion, iron tools and weapons, roads, cavalry, crossbows, and the ability to place enormous armies in the field. Older aristocratic warfare, with its rituals and chariot elites, has given way to contests in which mass infantry can be recruited from farming populations, and commanders can spend lives on a scale earlier rulers rarely possessed. Warfare is no longer an occasional test of prestige between nobles. It becomes an engine of state formation. The kingdoms able to extract the most labour, feed the most soldiers, punish failure most ruthlessly, and endure the longest attrition move closer to ruling all beneath heaven. Among these powers, Qin has made itself especially formidable, positioned in the west, strengthened by earlier legal and administrative reforms associated with Shangyang. It turns land, households, agricultural production, and military merit into instruments of expansion. Rank and reward can be tied to performance in war. Discipline can be severe. Conquered territory can be absorbed into a system designed not merely to raid neighbours, but to replace them. Qin is not invincible, and its enemies understand the danger it presents. But it possesses a relentless capacity to wage sustained campaigns. Zhao, farther east, is no minor opponent waiting to be swallowed. It, too, has adapted to the hard world around it. building strong armies and developing cavalry in response to its northern frontier. If any state can prevent Qin from pushing through the central contest for supremacy, Zhao appears capable of doing so. The crisis begins over Shangdang, a mountainous commandery held by the state of Han. Qin attacks Han and severs Shangdang from the rest of its territory. Rather than surrender the isolated region to Qin, local authorities offer it to Zhao, a decision that is either desperate defiance, calculated provocation, or both. Zhao accepts. In doing so, it gains strategically important territory, but also inherits the war Qin has already fought to win, from Qin's view. A prize nearly secured has been handed to its most dangerous rival. From Zhao's view, allowing Qin to absorb Shangdang without resistance would bring its power closer and make a future confrontation still worse. The valley and upland routes around Changping become the place where those calculations meet. At first, the Zhao commander is Lian Po, remembered as experienced, cautious, and unwilling to offer Qin the decisive battle it seeks. Facing Qin pressure, he establishes defensive positions and avoids reckless assaults. This is not cowardice. A massive army far from unlimited supplies can be defeated by hunger and exhaustion as readily as by weapons. Zhao's hope may be that fortified resistance stretches Qin's logistics until continued campaigning becomes intolerable, or that diplomacy produces relief before the army is forced into an unfavourable clash. For Qin, the stalemate is dangerous as well. Armies of this size consume grain with terrifying speed. Transporting food across difficult terrain costs more resources and exposes more weak points. Each day without decision drains both sides. What happens next survives through historical narrative shaped generations afterward, most importantly in the work of Sima Qian, writing under the Han dynasty more than a century after the battle. His account is indispensable, but it is not an immediate field report. It contains character lessons, political explanations, and dramatic contrasts that may sharpen the story beyond what can be independently verified. According to this tradition, Qin spreads rumours that it fears only Zhao Kuo, the son of a respected Zhao general, and has no concern about Lian Po. The Zhao court, frustrated by delay, and perhaps already strained by the cost of maintaining the army, replaces the cautious veteran with the younger man. Zhao Kuo is remembered as someone who knew military theory in words but lacked the practical judgment required in reality, a portrait so perfectly suited to moral instruction that it deserves caution. A defeated commander often becomes the container into which a state pours the blame for a disaster too large to explain easily. Qin, meanwhile, makes its own change in secrecy. Command is entrusted to Bai Qi, one of the most feared generals in Chinese history, a man whose campaigns are associated with staggering enemy losses and whose reputation rests less upon ceremonial glory than upon efficient destruction. Qin reportedly orders that anyone revealing his appointment will be executed. The reason is plain: Zhao must not understand too early that the battlefield has changed. Zhao arrives and adopts a more aggressive approach, moving away from Lian Po's defensive caution. Bai Qi allows the advance to develop, then withdraws in a manner that draws Zhao forces forward. What appears to be an opportunity begins closing like a gate. Qin troops cut the Zhao army away from its fortified camp and supply lines. Another force blocks the possibility of relief. The Zhao soldiers, now isolated, build defensive positions of their own, waiting for rescue or an opening. The old aggressor becomes the besieged. The account gives the encirclement a duration of 46 days, a length of time almost unbearable to imagine from inside the trapped army. Grain dwindles, then disappears. Horses, if still present, become food. Men weaken. Men. Command fractures beneath hunger and fear. Later sources claim that the starving soldiers turned to cannibalism, a detail that may belong partly to the conventional language of extreme siege suffering. Yet starvation in a surrounded army is no literary ornament. Even without accepting every terrible report, the human collapse is clear enough. An army numbering perhaps in the hundreds of thousands, whatever the precise figure, is no longer being asked to defeat Qin. It is being made incapable of continuing to exist. Zhao Kuo attempts to break out with selected troops. Qin crossbowmen or archers kill him during the effort, according to the traditional record. With the commander dead and supplies exhausted, the trapped Zhao army surrenders. Here, an ordinary military victory might have ended with captives disarmed, redistributed, ransomed, absorbed, enslaved, or released under conditions. Changping enters darker history because the captives are not simply prisoners. To Qin, they are a threat too large to feed, too numerous to release safely, and too important to allow back into Zhao's military strength. Bai Qi is said to have concluded that the newly taken region remained unreliable and that released soldiers would return to fight again. The decision attributed to him is extermination. Sima Qian reports that the surrendered soldiers of Zhao were deceived, divided, and killed, with only 240 young men released to return home and spread news of the disaster. He gives Zhao's total loss as more than 450,000 men, a figure that includes those killed in the fighting and those executed afterward. The number is famous because it is almost impossible to take in. 450,000 is not merely an army lost. Its towns emptied of sons, fathers, brothers, farm labourers, officials, craftsmen, and future children. It is a political body deprived in one stroke of a vast part of the human strength on which resistance depends. But the number must be handled carefully. Ancient states could mobilise large armies, especially in the harsh mass warfare of the Warring States period, and Changping may well have involved forces on an extraordinary scale. Yet totals in early historical accounts can reflect exaggeration, later reconstruction, symbolic enlargement, or the merging of campaign losses with the execution of captives. No administrative role survived that would allow the total to be checked line by line. Nor should the familiar claim that hundreds of thousands were buried alive be accepted uncritically in its most vivid popular form. The word traditionally associated with the killing can mean pit execution or disposal in a mass burial context. It does not prove that every prisoner was covered with earth while still alive. The distinction does not make the crime smaller. Men who surrendered and were then systematically slaughtered remain victims of one of antiquity's most appalling reported atrocities, whether the killing came by blade, arrow, or club, strangulation, or burial after death. The land around modern Gaping in Shaanxi has never entirely released the memory. For centuries, local tradition has connected the region with bones of the defeated. Archaeological discoveries in the wider Changping battlefield area have revealed human remains in pits and deposits, some bearing signs of violent injury, including wounds consistent with weapons. A major discovery reported in the 1990s drew renewed attention to the physical traces of the conflict. And later, bone-rich finds have continued to evoke the ancient account. Yet archaeology does not presently confirm 450,000 executed soldiers. It confirms that violence marked the landscape and that human bodies were deposited there in circumstances consistent with the battle's terrible reputation. The gulf between finding remains and verifying the full ancient total remains enormous. Once again, the record gives both evidence and uncertainty bones beneath the soil, and a number rising above them that may never be proved or dismissed completely. Even without accepting the maximum figure, Changping is different from many battles already left behind in this journey. At Marathon, Thermopylae, Plataea, Issus, and Gaugamela, killing swells as formations break and men are pursued. At Kalinga, conquest spreads suffering through death, deportation, and aftermath. At Changping, the central horror lies in what occurs after an army can no longer fight. Surrender does not save the defeated. Their helplessness becomes the condition that allows killing to proceed on a far greater scale. A battle has created captives. Policy turns captives into a population marked for removal. For Zhao, the wound is nearly fatal, but not immediately final. Qin seeks to press its advantage against the Zhao capital at Handan, yet the destruction at Changping has also exhausted Qin and sharpened fear among other states. Zhao resists with outside help, and Qin fails to erase it at once, by Qi, refusing or avoiding renewed command after political disagreement and changing circumstances, eventually falls from favour and is forced to die by suicide. The commander associated with annihilating Zhao's army does not live to see Qin's eventual unification of the rival states. Zhao survives for decades, but it survives diminished, haunted by a loss from which its military strength never fully recovers. Qin will finally conquer it as part of the chain of victories leading to the first imperial unification under Qin Shi Huang. Later generations remember that emperor through walls, laws, burning ambition, and the silent ranks of terracotta soldiers buried beside his tomb. But before those clay armies were formed to accompany imperial power into death, real armies had already been consumed to make such an empire possible. Changping exposes the price beneath unification. Political maps can later make conquest appear almost inevitable, as if one state naturally gathered the others into order, on the ground. Inevitability looks different. It looks like men held without food behind encircling forces, a commander killed in a failed escape, surrender followed by organised slaughter, and valleys in which farmers centuries later still encounter bones. There are battles remembered for courage, for strategy, for a king's personal charge, or for a civilization saved from invasion. Changping is remembered for the moment victory passes beyond necessity into eradication. Whether the traditional number is exact, enlarged, or impossible to recover, the story endured because it captured a truth about the age that produced it. States had learned to mobilize their populations in masses, therefore they had learned to destroy them in masses as well. The enemy army was no longer only an obstacle on a field, it was the living strength of a rival state, and eliminating it could seem as rational as defeating it. The soil near Changping does not offer an emperor's repentance, it offers fragments, pits, wounds, and a memory of terror sent home through the few said to have been spared. After this, another ancient killing field will present a different kind of horror, not hundreds of thousands of prisoners awaiting execution after surrender, but tens of thousands of armed men packed so tightly inside a battlefield trap that there is scarcely room left to fight, flee, or breathe. At Changping, the defeated are trapped by hunger, surrender, and the decision of their captors. At Cannae, less than half a century later and thousands of miles to the west, an army is destroyed while it is still armed, still pushing forward, still believing for part of the day that victory lies directly ahead. The horror here is not the waiting pit after submission, it is compression. It is the gradual discovery that the enemy has not been driven back at all, that the apparent weakness in front is a door closing behind, and that tens of thousands of men have entered a space from which discipline, courage, rank, and numbers can no longer rescue them. Among all the battles remembered from the ancient world, few preserve so terrible a picture of soldiers killed not because they refused to fight, but because they were packed together so tightly that fighting ceased to be possible. Rome has already become a power of extraordinary endurance by the time Hannibal Barca brings war into Italy. Through long struggles across the peninsula, the Roman Republic has learned to absorb defeat, call upon allied manpower, build new armies, and bind communities into a military system capable of returning to war after losses that would destroy smaller states. In the First Punic War, Rome has defeated Carthage after decades of naval and land conflict, taken Sicily, and later seized Sardinia and Corsica during Carthaginian weakness. Carthage remains wealthy and dangerous, however, and in Iberia, the Barcid family builds a new base of resources, troops, and ambition. Hannibal, son of Hamilcar Barca, inherits not only command but a world in which Rome and Carthage have left too much unfinished to avoid another reckoning. In 218 before the Common Era, Hannibal attacks Saguntum, crosses into the war that follows, and does what Rome does not expect him to achieve. He leads an army from Iberia across southern Gaul and over the Alps into Italy. The crossing later becomes legend, with elephants moving through snow and mountain peoples attacking the column, but its cost is real. Men and animals die before Hannibal reaches the country in which he intends to persuade Rome's allies that the Republic can be beaten. He does not need to storm Rome immediately. He needs to shatter the confidence holding Rome and Italy together. He begins with victories that should have been warning enough. At the Trebia River in 218, a Roman army is drawn cold and hungry across icy water into battle, then attacked by Hannibal's prepared forces and an ambush from concealment. The following year, at Lake Trasimene, the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius leads his army along the misty edge of the lake while Hannibal's troops wait on surrounding heights. When the attack comes, the Romans are caught between water and enemy lines in one of the largest ambushes ever inflicted upon a Roman army. Thousands are killed, thousands more are captured. Flaminius dies among his men. The road to Cannae is already strewn with Roman bodies. Hannibal has shown that he understands terrain, timing, concealment, provocation, and the weaknesses of commanders eager to erase earlier humiliation with one decisive success. Rome responds first with caution under the dictator Quintus Fabius Maximus, who avoids direct confrontation and shadows Hannibal, striking at opportunities while refusing to offer the pitched battle Hannibal wants. The strategy earns Fabius the name Cunctator, the delayer, and saves armies, but it does not satisfy a republic watching an enemy move through allied territory, burn fields, take supplies, and make Roman protection appear uncertain. Delay can be wise and still feel intolerable to those whose farms lie beneath enemy fires. Political pressure grows for a battle that will restore authority through force. In 216, Rome raises an army of exceptional size, perhaps the greatest it has yet placed together on a single field. Ancient sources differ in their totals, but they agree on the meaning of the mobilization the Republic intends not merely to check Hannibal, but to crush him. The two consuls for the year, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, command the Roman force. Later tradition, especially an account sympathetic to aristocratic caution, makes Paulus prudent and reluctant while portraying Varro as reckless, popular, and eager for battle. That contrast may contain truth, but it is also shaped by the need to explain catastrophe through character. Rome as a state wanted decision. Its army did not arrive at Cannae because one foolish man alone dragged an unwilling republic into danger. The losses of Trebia and Trasimene, the damage to Roman prestige, and the continuing presence of Hannibal in Italy created demand for resolution. The vast host assembled under the consuls is the physical expression of that demand. Hannibal occupies the supply depot at Cannae in Apulia, near the river Affidus, in a broad and exposed landscape where grain and movement matter as much as honour. The summer is hot, the terrain dusty, and the wind known in later tradition for throwing grit into the faces of men fighting across the plain. The Roman army is immense, built around heavy infantry drawn from Roman legions and allied contingents, with cavalry on its wings. The commanders appear to believe that mass itself can break the Carthaginian line. Rather than extending their infantry across a very wide front, the Romans form in unusual depth, concentrating men into a heavy central column intended to drive forward with overwhelming pressure. Against many enemies, such a mass might behave like a hammer. Against Hannibal, its power becomes material for a trap. The Carthaginian army is not truly Carthaginian in any simple sense. It is a composite force drawn from years of campaigning and from very different peoples, African infantry hardened by earlier victories, Iberian fighters, Gauls, Numidian cavalry, and heavier cavalry from Iberia and Gaul. They do not all carry the same weapons or fight in identical styles, and they do not all share the same reasons for following Hannibal. Some are bound by command, some by payment, some by hostility to Rome, some by loyalty formed in successful campaigns. Yet he has learned how to combine their differences. His Africans are disciplined veterans, his cavalry is superior in numbers and flexibility. His Gauls and Iberians can fight fiercely at the dangerous centre, his Numidians can harass, confuse, and delay. The army facing Rome is smaller, but it is not fragile. It is a weapon designed around the expectations of its opponent. Hannibal places his Iberian and Gallic infantry in the centre, curving forward toward the Romans in a protruding formation. On either side, but set back, stand the African infantry. His cavalry occupies the wings, with the stronger force under Hasdrubal opposite the Roman cavalry near the river and the Numidians facing Rome's allied horse on the other side. The formation seems to invite the Roman infantry to do exactly what it has come to do: attack the centre, drive it backward, and force victory through weight. When fighting begins, the cavalry clash on Hannibal's left is savage and unusually direct. Hemmed by the river and the battlefield position, Roman and Carthaginian horsemen fight at close quarters, men pulling at shields and bodies, striking where they can, falling beneath animals or being dragged into dust. Hasdrubal's cavalry overwhelms the Roman horse. Rather than scatter into pursuit for trophies or vengeance, They turn across the field toward the opposite wing, where the Numidians have kept the allied Roman cavalry occupied. Attacked from front and rear, Rome's mounted support breaks away. The Roman infantry, already committed to its forward drive, is losing the protection and awareness that cavalry provides at the edges of a battle. In the centre, the Roman advance appears at first to be succeeding. The forward bulging line of Gauls and Iberians yields beneath the tremendous pressure. Men die there in large numbers. Hannibal is asking the centre to retreat without becoming a rout, to absorb the strength of a far larger infantry force while preserving enough order that the withdrawal bends inward rather than disintegrates. It is an almost impossibly dangerous task. If the centre breaks too quickly, the Romans pour through and divide his army. If it holds too stubbornly, the enveloping shape never forms. But the line gives ground as intended, changing from a bulge toward Rome into a deepening hollow. Roman troops follow the apparent retreat. Their confidence and momentum pull them farther inward. The Roman formation becomes increasingly dense. Men behind push toward what they understand as a collapsing enemy centre. Units lose the room needed to use their weapons effectively. Those toward the front continue pressing against Iberians and Gauls who are still fighting while falling back under control. Those deeper in the mass cannot clearly see what is happening. Dust rises. Signals disappear into noise. The instinct of an enormous army advancing toward victory prevents it from sensing that the shape of the battlefield has changed. The Romans have not broken Hannibal's line. They have been drawn into it. Then the African infantry on the flanks turns inward. These troops, until now held back from the central pressure, attack the Roman sides. Their equipment may have included captured Roman arms from earlier victories, creating on parts of the field the grim sight of men struck by weapons once carried by lost Roman armies. The Roman column, designed to thrust forward, now has enemies pressing into its exposed flanks. At almost the same time, Carthaginian cavalry, having won on both wings, rides behind the Roman infantry and attacks from the rear. The trap is complete. The Roman army is surrounded. It is easy to draw the double envelopment as a clean diagram, a forward curve bending inward, flanks wheeling, cavalry closing the back. On a map it can look like perfect geometry. Inside it, there is nothing clean. The men nearest the outer edge fight desperately because they can see the enemy killing into them. Those farther inside may not initially know why forward movement has stopped, only that bodies are pressed against them from every side and that commands no longer lead anywhere. A legionary needs room for shield and weapon, room to step and brace and strike. Now many have barely room to turn. Shields are trapped against shoulders and backs. The wounded fall but do not create open ground. They become obstacles beneath living feet. Heat, dust, thirst, fear, and compression weaken men before a weapon reaches them. Some die facing the enemy. Some die unable even to raise an arm. The killing takes hours. This is perhaps the most appalling detail of Cannae, not the instant shock of ambush, or the final rush into a fleeing army, but the prolonged reduction of a surrounded human mass. Carthaginian troops can rotate at the edges, striking inward. The Romans at the centre wait as death moves toward them through their own ranks. Ancient accounts describe men digging their faces into the earth or suffocating amid the crush. Details that may be shaped by the horror Cannae left in Roman memory, but are grimly plausible in a packed encirclement. The consul Paulus is wounded and killed. Former consuls, quaestors, military tribunes, senators, equestrians, allied leaders, and ordinary farmers serving in the ranks die together. Rank cannot open a route through a ring of spears. The totals differ by source. Polybius gives more than 70,000 Roman infantry killed, while Livy offers a lower but still catastrophic figure of around 45,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry dead, with thousands captured. Modern estimates vary, often placing Roman and Allied deaths somewhere between 50 and 70,000. Whatever exact number is preferred, Cannae is among the greatest single-day losses suffered by any army in the ancient Mediterranean. Hannibal's own losses are severe, especially among the Gauls who hold the centre against Rome's initial force, but the scale is utterly unequal. Rome has not merely lost a battle, it has lost a vast portion of its available trained manpower, political leadership, allied soldiery, and confidence in the idea that superior numbers guarantee survival. Afterward, the battlefield becomes an inventory of disaster. According to later Roman tradition, Hannibal's men gather gold rings from dead Roman aristocrats in such abundance that they can be poured out as proof of victory before the Carthaginian authorities. The story may be embellished, but the social depth of the loss is not. Wealthy and politically connected families receive news that fathers and sons have vanished beside common infantrymen. Survivors straggle toward Canusium and other places of refuge, carrying the shame Romans associate with escape from such a defeat. Among them is a young Publius Cornelius Scipio, later remembered as helping prevent despairing survivors from abandoning Rome and eventually becoming the commander who defeats Hannibal in Africa. For the moment, however, there is no hint of redemption. There is only the expectation that Hannibal may march upon Rome itself. Many of Rome's enemies and uncertain allies respond to Cannae as Hannibal intended. Capua defects. Other communities break from Roman allegiance. Macedonia sees opportunity. Syracuse will later turn against Rome. The Republic appears mortally wounded, yet Hannibal does not immediately take Rome, and Rome does not ask for peace. When Carthaginian representatives connected with prisoners or negotiation arrive, the Roman response is refusal. Captured soldiers are not readily redeemed. New troops are raised, emergency measures reach deep into society, including the enlistment of men previously outside normal military expectation. The Republic returns to the strategy it had rejected: avoid Hannibal's chosen battle, strike elsewhere, rebuild, punish defectors, and make endurance itself the weapon he cannot destroy in one day. This is the bitter paradox of Cannae. Tactically, it is almost perfect, a victory studied for centuries as the model of encirclement. Humanly, it is a slaughterhouse. Strategically, it does not end the war. Rome loses perhaps more men in a single day than many ancient states could have fielded at all, and still the Republic survives, because its alliances, institutions, reserves of manpower, and capacity for ruthless persistence are larger than the army Hannibal has surrounded. The dead at Cannae prove his brilliance. They do not give him Rome. For the survivors and the bereaved, that distinction offers no comfort. No later Roman triumph can change the afternoon when the centre pressed forward. The flanks appeared, the cavalry closed behind, and a great army learned too late that it had marched into its own grave. Changping preserves the terror of prisoners destroyed after resistance ends. Cannae preserves the terror of resistance trapped inside itself, men still armed and still alive, waiting within a tightening ring while the space between victory and extinction collapses around them. Cannae does not teach Rome mercy. It teaches Rome that no defeat is final, while a state can still demand more men, more grain, more loyalty, and more pain from itself and from those bound to it. The Republic does not defeat Hannibal by finding one immediate answer to his brilliance. It survives him. It denies him the decisive settlement his victories seem to deserve, sends armies to other fronts, recovers rebellious territory with exemplary punishment, and eventually carries the war into North Africa under Publius Cornelius Scipio, the survivor once associated with the broken remnants after Cannae. At Zama, in 202 before the Common Era, Hannibal is defeated. Carthage loses its overseas empire, much of its fleet, its freedom to wage war independently, and the security that comes from being treated as an equal rival. Rome has escaped annihilation. The lesson it draws is not that destruction has limits. It is that a dangerous enemy must never again be allowed the strength to threaten Rome as Carthage once did. For decades after Zama, Carthage remains wealthy enough to make Romans uneasy. Its fields recover, its commerce endures, its people continue living behind walls across the sea from a republic that remembers Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae almost as wounds in the body. Carthage is constrained by treaty, especially in dealing with its aggressive Numidian neighbour Massinissa, a Roman ally who steadily presses against Carthaginian territory. When Carthage finally takes military action without Roman permission, Rome possesses the legal pretext it requires. But policy is rarely only the text of a treaty. A current in Roman public life has already made destruction imaginable. The elder Cato, after seeing the renewed prosperity of Carthage, is remembered as concluding his speeches with the insistence that Carthage must be destroyed. Whether every detail of the famous refrain was preserved exactly matters less than the hatred it represents. A city defeated half a century earlier is still treated as an intolerable danger, simply because it has not ceased to exist. In 149 before the Common Era, Roman forces arrive in Africa and Carthage initially submits to demands that reveal how desperate it is to avoid war. Hostages are surrendered, then weapons are demanded, and the Carthaginians hand over enormous stores of armour, artillery and missiles. Finally comes the order that makes obedience impossible. The population must abandon the city and resettle inland, away from the sea that has made Carthage what it is, a port city stripped from its harbours. Sanctuaries, houses, workshops, tombs, and memory would survive only in the biological sense. Carthage refuses. The war Rome has made unavoidable now becomes a defence by people who have already given up much of what they need to defend themselves. The city remakes weapons behind its walls, workshops operate with frantic urgency, metal is gathered, women are said to have cut their hair so it could be twisted into cords for siege engines, a detail transmitted through ancient tradition that may be shaped for drama but captures the desperation of a population trying to replace what it had surrendered. The Roman attack does not bring instant collapse. Carthage withstands siege for years, its defences, harbour system, and stubborn resistance frustrating commanders who expected an enemy already politically cornered to fall quickly. Hunger enters the city alongside fear. Each passing month reduces ordinary life to the requirements of defence food allocated, dead removed, damaged walls repaired, bodies exhausted by labour and deprivation. This is not a field battle whose dead can be counted after sunset. It is a whole urban world placed under a tightening sentence. In 147 command passes to Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of the Scipio who defeated Hannibal. The inheritance is almost too perfect for Roman memory. A younger Scipio brought to complete the destruction of the city the elder Scipio once humbled. He tightens the blockade, builds works to isolate Carthage, and seeks to close the remaining arteries by which it can resist. The Carthaginians attempt extraordinary measures, including secretly constructing a fleet within their enclosed harbour and bursting out unexpectedly, a feat of labour and ingenuity that briefly shocks the besiegers. But courage does not reverse the imbalance. Rome can replace losses and maintain pressure. Carthage is consuming itself to keep the walls alive. In the spring of 146, the final assault begins. Roman troops force their way through the harbour area and into the city. The struggle does not end at the breach. It climbs through streets and buildings in close, horrifying stages. Carthage is built densely, with multi-storey houses along narrow routes rising toward the Bursa, The fortified citadel. Defenders fight from rooftops and upper floors. Romans move by setting fires, breaking through walls from house to house, and killing in spaces where soldiers and civilians cannot always be separated, even if an attacker wishes to separate them. Streets become blocked by wreckage and bodies. Flames drive people out or trap them inside. For 6 days, the city is taken not as a single position but as a succession of homes, passages, temples, stairways, and human refuges converted into killing ground. At last, those remaining in the Bursa surrender in enormous numbers. Ancient accounts report that 50,000 survivors are taken and sold into slavery, while the total death toll is left less securely measured in a city already reduced by siege, famine, combat, and fire. Hasdrubal, the Carthaginian commander, surrenders to Scipio, while his wife, in the most dramatic version of the tale, denounces him and throws herself and their children into the burning temple, rather than submit. Like many scenes from destroyed cities, the story has passed through writers who understood its symbolic force. Carthage itself embodied as a woman choosing flame, while its male leader kneels before Rome. Whether every word and gesture occurred as later told cannot be known. The annihilation around it does not depend on theatrical detail. Carthage is burned and demolished. Its territory becomes the Roman province of Africa. The popular image that Romans sow salt into the ruins so nothing will grow there belongs to much later storytelling, rather than trustworthy ancient evidence. Rome did not need salt to make its meaning clear. It had taken a living rival city, killed or enslaved its surviving population, erased its political independence, and placed the productive land around it under Roman power. The extermination was not an uncontrolled excess after an uncertain fight. It was the fulfillment of a demand repeated before the war began. Carthage must be destroyed. Then Carthage was destroyed. Yet Rome's appetite for security and glory does not end with ruined cities. North of the Alps lies a vast collection of peoples whom Roman writers group under the name Gauls, communities diverse in politics, alliances, languages, rivalries, settlements, and relations with Rome. Older Roman memory carries its own trauma here. Centuries earlier, Gauls had sacked Rome, and the image of northern invaders remains useful whenever expansion can be represented as prevention. During the 1st century before the Common Era, Julius Caesar enters Gaul as a provincial commander with debts, ambition, political enemies, and an acute understanding that military success can turn into authority at home. Between 58 and 50 before the Common Era, he conducts campaigns that bring much of Gaul beneath Roman domination while producing a narrative of conquest written, in large part, by Caesar himself. His commentaries are masterpieces of controlled clarity. He writes of tribes, rivers, marches, negotiations, betrayals, engineering, cavalry, hostages, and battles with a calm voice that makes his own decisions appear necessary. Threats continually require response. Allies require protection. Rebellions require punishment. Crossings of rivers, invasions of Britain, and the building of a bridge across the Rhine demonstrate not merely capability, but an almost theatrical command of space. Yet beneath the clean prose is a war of extraordinary violence. Caesar later claims that Gaul was pacified through struggles that ancient biographers would summarize with vast figures of dead and enslaved, sometimes reaching 1 million in each category. Such totals cannot be accepted as precise accounting. They belong partly to the Roman habit of enlarging conquest through numbers. But the campaigns unquestionably kill, enslave, displace, and terrorize on a scale that transforms the region. The fate of the Veneti in Brittany exposes the structure beneath the justifications. Skilled maritime communities resist Caesar and detain Roman envoys during a dispute over supplies and hostages. Caesar builds a fleet, defeats them in naval fighting, and once they surrender, he orders their leading men executed and sells the rest into slavery. He explains the punishment as necessary because ambassadors must be protected. To Rome, this is discipline. To the communities emptied onto slave markets, it is annihilation by legal argument. In 52, widespread revolt gathers around Vercingetorix of the Arverni, the most serious effort to force Rome out. The Gauls adopt strategies intended to deny Caesar provisions, burning settlements rather than let them sustain his army. One city, Avricum, is spared from this scorched earth plan after its inhabitants insist it can be defended. Caesar besieges it through terrible weather and scarcity, his soldiers constructing siege works while deprived of supplies. When the Romans finally enter, frustration and vengeance burst loose. Caesar reports that almost no one is spared of roughly 40,000 people in the town. Only about 800 escape. The figure may be shaped to dramatize punishment and victory, but his own account presents mass killing as the expected outcome of resistance successfully overcome. Women, children, the old unarmed defenders are swallowed together in the language of assault. At Alesia later that year, Caesar surrounds Vercingetorix while a massive Gallic relief force tries to break the siege from outside. Roman soldiers build fortifications facing both directions, one line containing the besieged and another holding off rescuers. Hunger destroys those inside before the final defeat. The Mandubai, inhabitants of the site, are expelled from the town to conserve food and become trapped between lines. Refused entry by Romans and apparently not readmitted by the defenders, they linger in a human void created by strategy, families without food or refuge while two armies calculate survival around them. Their fate is not fully recorded, their near disappearance from the narrative is precisely the point civilians can be pushed in death and remain only a tactical detail in the story of great commanders. Resistance continues elsewhere. At Uxella Dunum, after the defenders are forced to submit, Caesar chooses a punishment meant to remain visible. Men who bore arms have their hands cut off and are released alive, mutilated witnesses to the cost of renewed rebellion. It is not slaughter, but it belongs to the same Roman grammar of conquest. Death removes enemies. Mutilation sends them walking through the landscape as warnings. Rome's accounts blur distinctions because Roman power benefits from the blur. A battle ends with pursuit with massacre, siege with enslavement, rebellion with collective punishment, conquest with a commander's political elevation. Carthage can be erased in the name of security. Avaricum can be slaughtered in the name of military necessity. Gaul can be devastated in a narrative of defensive intervention, while the man directing the devastation gathers wealth, loyal veterans, and fame sufficient to challenge the Roman state itself. The republic that refused to die after Cannae has learned how to make survival into entitlement. It has become the power whose enemies may be denied the future Rome insisted upon for itself. Yet conquest will not make Rome safe from violence. The armies trained and rewarded in foreign killing do not remain politically innocent when they turn south across the Alps. Soon, Rome's generals will bring the methods of empire home, and the state that destroyed Carthage and subdued Gaul will discover that an entire people can be treated as an enemy, even when that people is Roman. The armies that devastate Gaul do not stop at the edge of Caesar's ambition. Once Rome has learned to measure security by how far danger can be pushed from Italy, every river becomes a temptation. The Rhine is not merely a boundary. It is an invitation to cross, punish, negotiate, recruit, and eventually absorb. Beyond it lie communities. Roman writers gather beneath the loose name of Germans, not a single united people, but a shifting world of tribes, war leaders, rival families, traders, hostages, auxiliary soldiers, and local powers who may cooperate with Rome one year and resist it the next. Under Augustus, after civil wars have yielded to imperial rule, Rome possesses an army more permanent, professional, and widely deployed than the Republic ever maintained. Legions occupy roads, camps, river crossings, mines, towns, and newly conquered provinces. They build while they march. They survey, tax, judge, escort, intimidate, and fight. The empire seems to have discovered a method for turning military presence into geography itself. Then, in the damp woodlands east of the Rhine, 3 legions disappear. By the opening years of the Common Era, Roman forces have repeatedly campaigned beyond the Rhine. Commanders such as Drusus and Tiberius lead operations deep into the region, establishing forts, accepting submissions, taking hostages, and encouraging the belief that Germania can be reorganized like Gaul. Roman power does not require every community to love the empire. It requires enough cooperation, enough fear, enough roads and strong points, enough local leaders willing to attach their fortunes to Rome, and enough punishment when resistance appears. The process can look successful from the headquarters of an imperial governor. Traders move through camps, Germanic auxiliaries serve alongside Roman troops, legal disputes are heard under Roman authority, tribute and taxes begin to follow conquest. The landscape seems to be becoming governable. Publius Quinctilius Varus arrives within this confidence. He's not an inexperienced fool stumbling blindly into a wilderness, despite the way later disaster makes such portraits attractive. He has held high office and governed Syria, a province where Roman authority demanded both administrative force and the ability to manage unrest. In Germania, however, the task is different. A society only partly subjected to Roman demands is not the same as a province long accustomed to taxation, courts, garrisons, and the visible machinery of occupation. According to later Roman accounts, Varus behaves as though conquest is already complete, applying legal judgments and fiscal expectations to people not yet resigned to being ruled. This may be sharpened by hindsight. Defeated commanders are often accused of provoking what victors describe as inevitable resistance. Still, the deeper error is plain. Rome interprets submission, alliance, and temporary cooperation as lasting obedience. Among those trusted by Rome is Arminius, a nobleman of the Chersii who has received Roman citizenship, attained equestrian rank, and served in Roman military forces. He knows Roman formations, command habits, marching columns, allied contingents, and perhaps most importantly the assumptions that make imperial soldiers feel safe. He is not an outsider staring in wonder at Roman power. He is a product of its frontier system, one of the local elites Rome believes it can absorb and use. Yet he turns that knowledge against the empire, bringing together a coalition whose exact breadth and unity remain uncertain. Ancient sources present him as the architect of revolt, while later nationalism will try to make him the liberator of an imagined nation not yet existing in that form. What survives in the record suggests something more immediate to a leader who understands that Roman strength in ordered battle can become weakness on the march. If the landscape and the moment are chosen correctly. In the year 9, Varus leads the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, along with auxiliary troops, cavalry, servants, families, animals, wagons, and baggage, toward winter quarters. The total number of people caught in the coming disaster cannot be known exactly. 3 legions at full strength would represent around 15,000 heavy infantry, and with supporting troops and non-combatants the column may have numbered 20,000 or more. It may also have been smaller after detachments and normal campaigning losses. The important reality is not a precise total, but the character of the movement. This is not a battle line arranged upon open ground. It is a long travelling body, carrying the cumbersome life of an army through unfamiliar or insufficiently secured terrain while believing the route manageable. News arrives of an uprising somewhere nearby. Arminius and his associates encourage Varus to divert from the safer path to restore order. Then they leave the column, supposedly to gather allied support, and instead join the force preparing to strike it. The Romans move into difficult country. The traditional name Teutoburg Forest creates an image of endless dark trees, but the battlefield most strongly associated with the disaster lies near Calcres, where a wooded slope and a broad, wet, lowland narrow movement into a constrained corridor. The terrain is not an enchanted forest swallowing civilized soldiers. It is something more practical and more deadly poor ground for a long, baggage-heavy column trying to form into combat while enemies choose when and where to attack. Rain, mud, broken roots, trees, marsh, and the stretching of the marching line all matter. Shields and weapons become harder to handle in bad conditions. Wagons, slow movement. Soldiers separated from their units lose the visual order on which Roman drill depends. An army that can construct camps and roads with methodical discipline requires time and enough security to do so. Here attacks come from concealment and elevated ground. From men able to withdraw when the Romans attempt to respond and strike again where the column is weaker. The first blows do not necessarily destroy the force. That is part of the terror. The Romans continue moving, attempt to regroup, establish temporary camps, abandon or burn baggage, and search for a path out of the tightening disaster. The killing lasts across days. Roman legionaries are among the most dangerous infantry of the ancient world when formed, commanded, and supported in terrain where their system can function. At Calcres, the system is stripped apart. The column cannot easily deploy. Auxiliaries whose loyalties are uncertain may desert or join the rebellion. Messages become unreliable. The enemy knows routes and local ground better than the trapped force. The troops do not face one glorious clash they might reverse through courage. They face repeated attrition, fear, exhaustion, and the realization that every attempted movement may lead deeper into attack. Men wounded on the first day must struggle onward through rain and confusion. Horses panic or sink. Civilians and camp followers caught among the soldiers have no formation in which to shelter. The living must pass the fallen without knowing whether any destination remains open. Near Calcres, archaeology has recovered evidence that brings the catastrophe out of Roman literature and back into the soil coins associated with the period before or around the disaster. Military fittings, weapon fragments, tools, pieces of armour and equipment, lead sling projectiles, animal remains, and human bones. One of the most haunting traces is a defensive barrier constructed from turf and sand along the base of the slope. Apparently used by the attackers to shape the killing zone while Roman troops passed through the narrow ground below. A famous iron face mask from a Roman cavalry helmet, once coated in silver, was found in the area, an object designed to project rank and martial display reduced to corroded wreckage in a place where display offered no protection. Archaeology does not reconstruct every movement of every legion. Scholars still debate the full geography and sequence of the fighting, but it supports the central truth of the ancient account: a substantial Roman force entered a prepared landscape of attack and was dismantled there. As the situation collapses, Varus is wounded and takes his own life rather than fall alive into enemy hands. Senior officers do the same or attempt to escape. Some soldiers surrender, some are captured, some may briefly break through. Most of the force is destroyed. Later Roman accounts describe prisoners sacrificed, officers killed at ritual sites, severed heads, and the bones of the dead left unburied across the ground. Such descriptions are filtered through Roman trauma and the language used to depict enemies as barbarous. Yet capture after an uprising against occupation rarely promises mercy. 3 legionary eagles are lost, symbols so charged that their recovery will later become a matter of imperial honour. The legion numbers themselves, 17, 18, and 19, are never used again by Rome. Administrative absence becomes a memorial. When news reaches Augustus, the loss is said to break through the emperor's cultivated composure. The later story has him crying out for Varus to give back his legions, striking his head against a door and refusing customary grooming and mourning. The scene may be shaped by biography, crafted to express the unthinkable scale of the reverse, yet it captures what Teutoburg means in Rome. This is not a distant unit damaged on a difficult frontier. 3 legions, the visible organs of imperial power, have been removed almost entirely. Years of assumptions about the lands east of the Rhine collapse with them. The empire that recently appeared capable of pressing its order indefinitely outward discovers that a frontier may be created not where Rome wishes to stop, but where resistance makes advance too expensive to trust. Rome does retaliate. Under Tiberius and then Germanicus, armies return across the Rhine. Germanicus campaigns repeatedly between 14 and 16 fights, Arminius and allied forces, buries Roman bones encountered at or near the old battlefield, and recovers 2 of the lost legionary standards, while the 3rd is regained decades later. These expeditions demonstrate that Rome has not become incapable of entering Germania or defeating its forces in battle. Roman troops can cross the river, burn settlements, take captives, and win engagements. Arminius himself does not found a secure kingdom. He is eventually killed by members of his own extended political world amid internal rivalries. But punitive success is not the same as renewed conquest. Augustus' successor Tiberius ultimately ends the effort to make Germania beyond the Rhine a normal Roman provincial acquisition. The Rhine settles into a far more enduring imperial boundary than earlier ambition intended. The consequences stretch beyond the forest. Rome continues to manage frontiers with forts, watchtowers, roads, river fleets, client rulers, diplomacy, trade, recruitment, and sudden violence. Along the Rhine and Danube, the empire is never merely crouched behind walls, it reaches beyond them constantly, buying loyalty, punishing raids, manipulating rivalries, and taking soldiers from communities once defined as threats. Yet Teutoburg remains a warning buried within the method. Those recruited at the edge of empire can learn its strengths. Those labelled pacified can be waiting. Roads that move legions outward can also carry news of disaster home. The warning is not always heeded. In 86 on the Danube frontier, the Dacian king Decebalus destroys an invading Roman force led by the Praetorian prefect Cornelius Fuscus. Fuscus marches into difficult country seeking a punitive victory after Dacian attacks south of the river, but his army is ambushed and defeated, a legion's eagle is lost, and the commander dies. The details are much thinner than those surrounding Varus, but the pattern is familiar. Outrage drives invasion. Confidence drives pursuit. Hostile terrain allows an enemy to turn Roman punishment into Roman mourning. Domitian's later settlement with Dacia is presented by hostile Roman writers as humiliating, in part because Rome finds itself paying and negotiating with a kingdom it had expected to chastise. Years later, Trajan will return with overwhelming preparation and conquer Dacia, but the great column celebrating that conquest rises from a frontier whose dangers had already consumed an army. Farther along the Danube in the later 2nd century, under Marcus Aurelius, pressure from Marcomanni, Quadi, and other peoples breaks across borders once treated as controllable. Raiding forces reach deep into imperial territory and threaten Italy itself. While plague and military strain make replacement harder than it had been in the confident days of expansion, Rome responds fiercely and survives, but the wars reveal that its frontier is not a hard line between order and chaos. It is a living zone where migration, scarcity, political upheaval, Roman interference, opportunity, and fear can send armed groups through defences that appear stable until they are tested. Teutoburg remains the clearest image of that vulnerability because it reduces empire to a march in the rain. No enormous capital falls, no emperor is captured, no treaty announces a change in the world. There is only a column entering difficult ground beneath the guidance of allies it thinks it understands, then vanishing under attack until the forest and marsh hold the equipment of men who expected to return to winter quarters. Rome will continue to conquer, build, punish, recruit, and endure for centuries. But beyond the Rhine, a space remains outside direct imperial rule, and in that space lies the memory that even the most disciplined army can be lost when confidence goes ahead of knowledge. Foreign enemies have now taught Rome the limits of its reach. The more dangerous lesson is still waiting. The legions that decide the fate of frontiers can also decide the fate of Rome itself. The legions do not need a forest ambush to become dangerous to Rome. They need only loyalty redirected from the state to the men who pay them, reward them, protect them from prosecution, and promise them land when their fighting ends. For centuries, the Republic presents warfare as service to a shared political order, however unequal and ruthless that order may be. But conquest stretches the arrangement until it begins to break. Campaigns last longer and range farther from Italy. Generals command the same soldiers across years of danger and enrichment. Spoils, promotions, citizenship, settlements, and personal survival become tied not to distant institutions in Rome, but to the commander standing before the army. The men who kill for Rome in Spain, Africa, Gaul, Greece, and Asia eventually discover that they can kill Romans for the future they believe Rome owes them. The Republic has already glimpsed this abyss before Julius Caesar returns from Gaul. In the early 1st century before the Common Era, the social war pits Rome against many of its Italian allies, communities that have supplied men for Roman expansion while remaining denied equal political rights. The war is savage and costly, fought across the peninsula by men familiar with the same methods and often the same military culture. Rome ultimately grants much of what the allies sought, but only after Italy has been torn open. Then rivalry between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla brings Roman armies directly against Rome itself. Sulla marches his soldiers into the city, an act once nearly unthinkable. His enemies later seize power, killings follow. Sulla returns victorious from the east and initiates formal proscriptions. A list of men declared enemies whose murder is rewarded and whose property can be confiscated. Heads appear in public spaces. Private vengeance dresses itself in political legality. The city that destroyed others in the name of order learns how easily order can be made to authorize domestic terror. Sulla resigns and dies, but the precedent does not die with him. The Republic continues outwardly, holding elections, debating in the Senate, administering provinces, and commanding armies. Beneath the ritual, competition has changed. Political defeat may now mean exile, ruin, or death. Military command offers protection against enemies at home, and successful war offers the wealth needed to purchase influence. Pompey the Great rises through eastern victories and extraordinary commands. Crassus turns wealth into political power, and then dies with much of his army in disastrous war against Parthia at Carrhae. Caesar, tied for a time to both men in an unstable alliance, uses his long command in Gaul to accumulate money, fame, and troops who know victory under him far more intimately than they know the Senate. When Caesar's enemies demand that he surrender command before returning to political life, the argument is clothed in legality and fear in equal measure. Caesar understands that entering Italy as a private citizen may leave him exposed to prosecution and political destruction, his opponents understand that allowing him to return with the prestige and loyalty gained in Gaul may leave the Republic subject to one man. In January of 49, before the Common Era, Caesar crosses the Rubicon with troops. Beginning a civil war whose decisive fact is clear before any great battlefield forms, a Roman general has chosen to advance upon his own country with an army hardened by foreign conquest. Pompey and many senators withdraw from Italy rather than be trapped before sufficient forces are gathered. Caesar moves with startling speed, presenting clemency when it serves him, capturing men and allowing them to go free in ways that distinguish him from Sulla's memory and encourage surrender elsewhere. Yet mercy is also a weapon. The general who releases captured Romans can claim to be restoring peace rather than conquering citizens. Even while his legions force the political world to yield, fighting spreads through Spain, the Adriatic, Greece, Africa, and beyond. Civil war makes the Mediterranean one immense Roman battlefield, with provincial communities compelled to supply and suffer for factions claiming to save the same republic. In 48, Caesar crosses into Greece to confront Pompey. For a time, he is the commander at greatest risk. Near Dyrrhachium, Pompey's forces break through Caesar's positions and inflict a serious reverse. Caesar later suggests that the enemy failed to exploit a moment that might have finished the war. Pompey, with more senators, greater resources, and a substantial army around him, is under pressure to achieve decision. He follows Caesar into Thessaly, near Pharsalus. Two Roman armies prepare to settle by weapons, a crisis born from Roman law, ambition, fear, and the habits of empire. Pompey's army is larger, especially in cavalry. His plan depends upon that strength. His cavalry will sweep Caesar's horsemen aside, attack the vulnerable flank, and fold victory around Caesar's infantry. Caesar anticipates the danger. Behind his thin cavalry line, he stations selected cohorts concealed or held back for the crucial moment, instructing them to strike the attacking cavalry with particular aggression when it closes. The main lines meet with the discipline of men trained in the same military world. There is no easy difference in equipment or courage by which one side can recognize an alien enemy. Standards, orders, shields, pila, swords, formations, camp routines, and the expectations of battle are Roman on both sides. Men may face former companions, clients of the same political patrons, or fellow citizens whose only unforgivable act is serving the wrong commander. Pompey's cavalry drives forward, overwhelms or disperses Caesar's weaker horse, and begins the maneuver intended to expose the flank. Then Caesar's reserve cohorts attack. The cavalry, surprised and pressed, breaks away. Pompey's left is uncovered. Caesar commits the reserve against the main line while his veteran infantry continues its assault. Pompey's army loses cohesion and falls back toward camp. The killing intensifies as one Roman force pursues another into the defensive works built by men who expected them to offer protection. Pompey himself departs the field, stunned by the collapse of the army upon which his cause depends. Ancient casualty claims are unequal and politically shaped, with Caesar reporting remarkably low losses for his own army, and many thousands killed or captured on Pompey's side. The precise numbers cannot be secured. What is certain is the deeper disgrace of the battlefield. Thousands of Roman dead purchased not territory from a foreign king, but supremacy for one Roman faction over another. Caesar again emphasizes clemency toward captured citizens. Many are pardoned, some eventually return to political life. Yet clemency cannot restore the men already killed, or the republic whose decisions now depend upon the victorious commander's permission. Pompey flees to Egypt, expecting refuge from a kingdom whose politics he has once influenced. Instead, advisors to the young Ptolemy XIII decide that presenting Caesar with his rival's death may be safer than protecting a defeated man. Pompey is murdered as he comes ashore, stabbed before the eyes of his wife and son. His severed head is delivered to Caesar. Roman civil war has travelled so far outward that a Roman leader who once celebrated triumphs over foreign enemies is killed on a foreign beach as an offering to another Roman. Caesar becomes dictator, defeats remaining resistance in Africa and Spain, and returns to a Rome that honours him with powers and distinctions increasingly incompatible with the old republican fear of kingship. Many who accept his pardons do not accept his dominance. On the Ides of March, in 44, conspirators surround him during a Senate meeting and stab him to death beneath the statue of Pompey. They declare liberty restored. Instead, they open another stage of killing. Caesar's assassination removes the man at the centre of power without removing the soldiers, money, rivalries, fears, and ambitions that made his power possible. His adopted heir Octavian, young and initially underestimated, enters the contest with extraordinary patience and ruthlessness. Mark Antony, Caesar's experienced lieutenant, commands influence, troops, and a powerful claim upon Caesar's political legacy. Marcus Lepidus adds forces and position. After shifting confrontations and arrangements, the three form a legally authorised triumviral regime not to end violence, but to direct it. Prescriptions return, names are posted. Property becomes reward. Men die because their wealth is useful, because their voices are dangerous, because enemies want old debts settled under official permission. Cicero, whose speeches had attacked Antony and defended a vision of senatorial liberty already fading beyond recovery, is captured and killed. His head and hands are displayed in the Roman Forum, instruments of speech mutilated as trophies. The horror of Sulla has not been remembered as a boundary. Rome must never cross again. It has been remembered as a method. The assassins Brutus and Cassius gather forces in the east. drawing money and soldiers into their own claim that the Republic can still be rescued from Caesar's heirs. In 42, near Philippi in Macedonia, the rival armies meet across a landscape of plain, marsh, camps, and fortified approaches. The numbers are enormous by the standards of Roman civil warfare, perhaps involving well over 100,000 fighting men across both sides, though exact totals remain uncertain. Much of Rome's armed strength is now assembled not against Parthians or northern raiders, but against itself. The first battle is confused and divided. Brutus's troops successfully attack Octavian's camp, and later hostile tradition claims Octavian survives only by hiding or being absent due to illness or warning. On the other wing, Antony forces his way into Cassius's position. Cassius, unable to see that Brutus has gained an advantage elsewhere and believing the entire cause lost, orders a freedman to kill him. Misunderstanding on a chaotic field removes one of the Republican commanders before the day's result is fully known. Several weeks later, the second battle comes. Brutus's army is pressed into a fight he may prefer to delay, his position weakened by supply problems, desertions, and the difficulty of holding together a cause after Cassius's death. His forces are defeated. Brutus withdraws and kills himself rather than be captured. Philippi ends the armed power of Caesar's assassins, but it does not restore peace. Antony and Octavian divide responsibilities and territories, while land in Italy is confiscated to settle veterans. Dispossessed communities pay the cost of rewarding men whose loyalty keeps rulers alive. Conflict erupts at Perugia, where opponents of Octavian are besieged and defeated. Stories of executions afterward, including claims of sacrifices on the anniversary of Caesar's death. Maybe embellished by hostile tradition, but the environment of revenge is real. Sextus Pompey, son of the murdered Pompey, controls Sicily for a time and disrupts grain supplies, transforming hunger in Rome into another weapon of civil struggle. Lepidus is pushed aside. The political world narrows until two principal powers remain Antony in the east, increasingly tied to Cleopatra VII of Egypt, and Octavian in the west. Mastering the art of presenting his rival not as a Roman competitor but as a man corrupted by a foreign queen, Antony and Cleopatra are not simply lovers drifting into catastrophe. Together they command resources, fleets, dynastic possibilities, and an eastern political vision dangerous to Octavian. Yet propaganda is decisive before the final fighting begins. Octavian obtains and publicizes a version of Antony's will, portraying him as a Roman prepared to privilege Alexandria and Cleopatra's children over Rome. War is formally declared against Cleopatra, allowing the coming confrontation to appear as a national struggle against a foreign monarch rather than another civil war between Roman leaders. In 31, their fleets meet near Actium on the western coast of Greece. This is not Cannae, where a mass of infantry is encircled and cut down in one crowded field. Nor is it Philippi, where citizen armies crash directly into one another until their political causes collapse with their commanders. Actium is shaped by blockade, disease, desertion, supply problems, naval positioning, and the slow deterioration of Antony and Cleopatra's strategic options. Octavian's indispensable commander Agrippa has seized key positions and strangled their freedom of movement. When battle finally occurs, Antony and Cleopatra break out with part of their fleet and treasure, escaping toward Egypt while much of their remaining force is left to surrender. Ancient moralists turn the flight into a drama of Antony abandoning battle for Cleopatra. The reality may involve a planned breakout from a failing position. Either way, the political effect is ruinous. A leader who leaves with a queen while his forces remain behind cannot easily retain the appearance of Roman command. The final act comes in Alexandria in 30. Octavian advances. Antony's remaining military position dissolves. Reports that Cleopatra has died help push him towards suicide, and he dies after being brought to her. Cleopatra attempts to negotiate within the narrow room defeat allows, then takes her own life rather than be displayed in Octavian's Roman triumph. The method of her death, traditionally attributed to a venomous snake, remains uncertain. Her son, by Caesar, Caesarion, is killed on Octavian's orders or with his approval, because a living son of Caesar in Egypt is a political possibility too dangerous to leave alive. Antony's children by Cleopatra are taken into Octavian's control. Egypt becomes Roman territory. The wealth of its royal house helps finance the victorious regime. Octavian will soon become Augustus, presenting his supremacy not as monarchy born from civil bloodshed, but as a restoration of order after chaos. He has reason to do so. Romans are exhausted. The generations from Marius and Sulla through Caesar, Pompey, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, and Cleopatra have filled Italy and the provinces with confiscation, execution, conscription, siege, famine, and battlefield death. Peace, even peace ruled by one man, can appear merciful after the Republic's competition has consumed so many citizens. Rome's empire is often imagined as the reward for military superiority abroad, but the imperial system of Augustus also rises from a darker fact. The Republic has become too lethal to survive its own commanders. Pharsalus, Philippi, and Actium are not side stories to Roman expansion, they are its inward turn, the same discipline that defeated foreign armies, the same loyalty formed through plunder and hardship, the same refusal to accept defeat that once carried Rome beyond Cannae. Now make it possible for Romans to kill Romans until one victor remains. The frontier will continue to demand blood, and later, emperors will still face enemies beyond the borders. But after the civil wars, every legion also carries a quiet threat within the state it serves. An army powerful enough to guard an empire is powerful enough to choose its master, and perhaps to destroy him. Section 14. The Empire Augustus builds out of civil war does not remain unchanged. Centuries pass. Emperors rise through inheritance, adoption, assassination, army proclamation, palace intrigue, and battlefield survival. Provinces are divided and reorganized. Christianity moves from persecuted faith to imperial religion. Capitals shift closer to threatened frontiers. Enemies cross borders, enter treaties, serve in Roman armies, trade with Roman towns, raid when opportunity opens, and sometimes seek protection inside the imperial world rather than its destruction. Rome is no longer a republic devouring itself in the struggle to produce one ruler. It is a vast late ancient state attempting to manage immense pressures with armies that are still formidable but increasingly demanded everywhere at once. On one summer day in 378, near the city of Adrianople in Thrace, the Eastern Emperor Valens will march against a displaced Gothic people whom Roman officials first admitted, then exploited, then drove into revolt. By sunset, and the emperor will be dead, much of his field army destroyed, and Rome will possess another battlefield memory too terrible ever to become comfortable. The crisis begins not with an invasion launched in confident strength, but with flight. In the 370s, the appearance and expansion of the Huns across the regions north of the Black Sea send shockwaves through Gothic communities. The Huns are not a simple storm falling upon a motionless population. Peoples move, negotiate, divide, fight, and seek survival in different ways. Yet their arrival creates a pressure severe enough that large groups of Goths approach the Danube frontier of the Roman Empire in 376 and ask to be admitted. Among them are the Tuvingi, led by figures including Fritigern. They bring families, possessions, animals, warriors, elders, and children. The Danube is not merely a border to be breached. It is, for these refugees, the line between a world collapsing behind them and an empire that appears capable of offering land, food, and protection. For Valens, then campaigning in the east against Persia, the arrival of Goths may initially seem manageable and even useful. Settled under Roman supervision, they can become farmers, taxpayers, and recruits. Late Roman power has long depended in part upon incorporating outsiders, recruiting frontier peoples, negotiating with groups beyond the borders, and transforming migrants or defeated enemies into imperial resources. The admission of Goths is not in itself evidence of collapse. It's a familiar imperial technique attempted on a far larger and more dangerous scale than local administrators are prepared to handle. The crossing becomes chaos. Numbers are difficult to recover, with later estimates ranging widely, but this is clearly not a small military band. It is a moving population. People crowd the riverbanks and cross in boats and improvised craft, while Roman officials fail, or choose not, to keep reliable count and control. Weapons that should have been surrendered may remain in Gothic hands through concealment, bribery, or sheer administrative breakdown. Other Gothic groups, including the Greuthungi, cross amid the confusion without the same formal authorization. The Empire has admitted people whose desperation makes them vulnerable, and whose retained military strength makes mistreatment extraordinarily dangerous. Mistreatment follows quickly. Roman authorities responsible for feeding and supervising the new arrivals exploit the shortage of supplies and the helplessness of those dependent upon them. Ammianus Marcellinus, the major surviving historian of these events, writes with disgust of Roman commanders profiting from Gothic hunger, exchanging miserable food and even dog meat for valuables and enslaved children. His narrative carries moral purpose as well as information, presenting corruption as the seed of catastrophe. But the underlying failure is credible and devastating. People who crossed expecting protection find themselves starving under officials who see their misery as opportunity. Families surrender what they possess. Parents surrender children. Warriors asked to become obedient settlers instead watch the empire treating them as prey. At Marcianople, the relationship breaks entirely. Roman commander Lupicinus invites Gothic leaders, including Fritigern, to a banquet while Gothic followers remain outside the city, hungry and tense. Fighting breaks out between Romans and Goths beyond the walls. Lupicinus, fearing treachery or attempting his own, reportedly orders Gothic attendants killed inside the banquet setting. Fritigern escapes and returns to his people with a cause around which fear and anger can gather. An arrangement meant to absorb migrants into Rome becomes revolt. Gothic groups spread through Thrace, joined by escaped slaves, miners, and others with reasons to resent imperial authority. They seize supplies, horses, weapons, and momentum. The empire has not been attacked by an unknown enemy appearing suddenly from beyond sight. It has manufactured an armed rebellion from people already within its frontier. Roman forces move against them, but the conflict refuses to end quickly. In 377, at a battle known as Adsalices, or the Battle of the Willows, Roman troops and Gothic forces fight savagely without decisive resolution. Both sides suffer heavily. The Goths maintain their position behind defensive arrangements of wagons, while Rome fails to crush the rebellion. Fritigern understands that the wagon circle protects not only fighters, but families, and whatever supplies his people can retain. This is not simply a raiding army wandering through imperial territory. It is a community at war, forced to move and defend itself while seeking enough food and ground to survive. Valens now returns from the eastern frontier to deal personally with the danger. His western imperial colleague, the young Gratian, is moving to assist him after campaigning against the Alemanni. The sensible course is to wait until Roman forces combine, yet war rarely unfolds beneath the rule of sense alone. Valens has reasons to desire victory before Gratian arrives. He may resent the younger emperor receiving credit for successes in the west. He may believe that delay allows the Goths to plunder further or strengthen their position. He may simply trust reports that the enemy is smaller than it really is. Ancient sources suggest Roman reconnaissance severely underestimates Fritigern's strength, perhaps reporting only about 10,000 Gothic fighters while significant cavalry is absent from the visible camp. The decision is made under a familiar poison: incomplete intelligence mixed with political urgency and the confidence that Roman arms can correct any mistake once battle begins. On the morning of August 9th, 378, Valens marches out from Adrianople. The day is brutally hot. His soldiers advance for hours through dust and sun toward the Gothic wagon circle, perhaps without adequate food or water before the confrontation. Somewhere ahead lies a mass of wagons drawn into a defensive ring, with Gothic families and possessions within or around it, and warriors prepared to hold the position. Fritigern sends envoys and prolongs negotiations, whether he sincerely seeks agreement, hopes to avoid a battle until his cavalry returns, or skillfully combines both possibilities cannot be known with certainty. What matters is that time works against the Romans. They have marched in heat. Their lines are not perfectly settled. Tempers and confusion grow while messages pass between emperor and enemy. The Gothic cavalry is away from the camp, likely foraging, and among it are Grüthungi and Alan horsemen whose return will transform the field. If Valens attacks before they arrive with full coordination, he might crush or force the wagon defences. If he waits or loses order, he risks meeting not only the infantry in front of him but mobile forces striking the exposed Roman army from the side. The Roman line forms unevenly. Units arrive and deploy under pressure. Before negotiations have settled anything, and before Valens has imposed complete command upon his formations, Roman troops on part of the line begin an attack, perhaps through impatience, misunderstanding, or local initiative. The battle starts not as a controlled imperial decision but as a movement that pulls the rest of the army into danger. At first, Roman forces drive toward the wagon circle. The front becomes a place of arrows, shields, shouting, dust, men pressing uphill or across rough ground toward defenders who know they are fighting with their families and survival close behind them. The Goths resist from the defensive ring while the Roman army struggles to bring its strength properly to bear, then the absent cavalry returns. Horsemen appear against the Roman flanks with a speed and shock that the exhausted infantry cannot easily absorb. The precise timing and sequence remain debated, and Adrianople should not be reduced to a simplistic story in which Roman infantry is suddenly made obsolete by mounted barbarians. Roman armies had used cavalry effectively for centuries and would continue to do so. The disaster comes from several forces combining bad intelligence, a premature engagement, severe heat and fatigue, incomplete deployment, the defensive strength of the Gothic position, and the return of mounted forces against a Roman army already committed and increasingly disordered. The Roman cavalry is driven away or fails to protect the infantry. The foot soldiers are left compressed under attack, their formations bending inward as enemies press from multiple directions. The scene begins to resemble Cannae, and Ammianus himself evokes the old Roman catastrophe. But unlike the legions at Cannae, these soldiers are not trapped by Hannibal's deliberately shaped infantry crescent closing with calculated perfection. They are trapped by a battle allowed to become chaotic before all its dangers are visible. Some Roman units may never fully enter the fight before the crisis consumes them. Others stand and die in dense ranks, unable to maneuver, retreat, or receive orders through the noise and dust. Missiles fall into packed men. Cavalry strikes the edges. Gothic infantry surges from the wagon defences as Roman control weakens. Valens remains somewhere within the collapse. Two principal traditions emerge about his death. In one, he is struck by an arrow and dies among the common mass of slain soldiers, his body never recognised or recovered. In another, wounded and carried to a farmhouse with a small group of attendants. He is burned alive when Goths, unaware of the imperial prize inside, set the building alight after being fired upon. Neither version can be confirmed. The uncertainty is fitting in the most terrible possible way. An emperor enters battle surrounded by the visible structure of Roman authority and disappears so completely within its defeat that even his manner of death cannot be securely known. The slaughter continues until darkness. Ammianus claims that scarcely 1/3 of the Roman army escapes, and he compares the calamity only to Cannae in Roman memory. The exact death toll cannot be reconstructed, and modern estimates remain cautious, but the destruction of the Eastern Field Army is unquestionable. Senior commanders die, units are broken apart, weapons, standards, horses, and equipment are lost. Men who survived years of frontier service and imperial campaigning are cut down within Roman territory by a people who had entered the empire pleading for safety only 2 years before. Adrianople is not merely a defeat inflicted by an external invader, it is a catastrophe created through administrative corruption, political misjudgment, strategic impatience, and the final physical violence of men who see no safe way back into obedience. The Goths attempt to exploit the victory, moving against Adrianople and threatening wider areas, but they do not suddenly topple the Eastern Roman state. Cities with strong walls are difficult to seize without the siege capacity needed to reduce them. Constantinople does not fall. Roman government continues. Gratian appoints Theodosius as Eastern Emperor in 379, and the war drags on through campaigning, recruitment, negotiation, and exhaustion. In 382, an agreement settles Goths within imperial territory under terms whose exact character scholars still debate. They appear to retain a significant degree of cohesion under their own leaders while owing military service to Rome. a settlement later seen as a precedent of great significance. Yet it is dangerous to make Adrianople alone the moment the Roman Empire falls, or to imagine that one battle immediately replaces Roman authority with barbarian kingdoms. The Eastern Empire survives for more than 1,000 years in changing form. Roman armies will still win battles, command resources, and manage peoples within and beyond the frontiers. What Adrianople changes most powerfully is confidence. Rome has suffered devastating defeats before and recovered from them. It lost armies to Hannibal, legions to Arminius, emperors to assassins and civil wars. But here, the late empire loses an emperor and a central army in an encounter born from its inability to manage displaced people at its own border. The battle reveals an imperial system under pressure from many directions at once: external migration and invasion, internal administrative abuse, divided command, shortage of reliable manpower, competition between emperors, and the increasing difficulty of forcing every crisis back into older patterns of submission. Later generations will treat Adrianople as a signpost on the road to the Western Empire's dissolution, and not without reason. Goths who once sought entry into Roman territory will remain central players in imperial politics and war. Within a generation, Alaric and his followers will sack Rome itself in 410, an event whose shock echoes far beyond its immediate military meaning. But the line from the fields outside Adrianople to the sack of Rome is not straight or inevitable. People make decisions at every stage emperors recruit, bargain, betray, delay, attack, and negotiate. Gothic leaders divide, serve, revolt, and seek land and security within a world still defined by Roman wealth and prestige. History is not a wall collapsing after one stone is removed. It is a structure repeatedly damaged, repaired, stressed, and altered until it no longer resembles what earlier generations expected to endure. On the evening after Adrianople, such distant consequences are invisible. What remains is the field. The August heat softens into darkness over bodies lying thick where the Roman infantry made its last stand. Somewhere among them is the emperor, indistinguishable from the soldiers whose lives his decision placed within the trap. The Goths have won a survival they could scarcely have imagined when they begged to cross the Danube. The Romans who escape carry news no imperial ceremony can easily soften a ruler has vanished. An army has been torn open, and the empire has been forced to learn that those it mistreats at the frontier may become more dangerous than those it once feared beyond it. After Adrianople, the search for the bloodiest ancient battle cannot end with the name of one field and a single number carved beside it. The journey has crossed too many forms of killing for that. Men have died in river valleys before writing, beneath chariot wheels in the service of kings, at narrow passes turned into monuments, in cities starved into surrender, within traps designed with terrifying precision, after laying down their weapons beneath siege fires. In forests where an empire lost its direction, and on Roman fields where citizens cut down citizens, until monarchy appeared kinder than competition. Some battles leave bodies, some leave boasting, some leave both, and even then they rarely agree. What can be counted is never quite the whole catastrophe, and what cannot be counted often matters most. At Tollense, the ancient dead return almost without explanation. The river preserves wounds, arrowheads, fragments of bodies, and signs that organised violence reached deeply into a Bronze Age landscape once imagined as too scattered for such a clash. There is no surviving commander claiming 10,000 enemies killed. That silence lends the remains an unusual honesty, but it also withholds almost everything the living would most want to know: who fought there, and why. What community waited for men who never returned? Were the dead invaders, escorts, rivals over a crossing, members of a larger political struggle whose names disappeared with them? Archaeology can reveal force and injury, sometimes origin and diet, sometimes the movements of people across surprising distances. It cannot always restore motive. The valley shows that a battle may be real beyond doubt while its story remains almost entirely lost. At Megiddo, the problem reverses. The narrative survives because Thutmose III wants it to survive. His scribes record his dangerous route, the enemy's flight, the missed chance to seize the city immediately, the siege, and the inventory of spoils that proves Egyptian control. Yet the dead do not occupy the centre of that record. Chariots, horses, livestock, prisoners, tribute, and submission are more useful to kings than an honest reckoning of men whose bodies made those gains possible. At Kadesh, Rameses II goes farther, taking a battle in which his army is surprised and nearly broken and transforming it into a monument of solitary heroism. The reliefs are evidence, but they are also argument. Their scale tells not simply what happened, but how desperately a ruler wanted later viewers to understand what happened. The Greek battles against Persia reveal the power of communal memory rather than royal inscription. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea become more than military encounters because they answer the deepest fear of small states facing immense imperial power. The dead become proof that resistance was possible, that defeat could carry honour, and that survival deserved a permanent story. But stories of deliverance simplify the people who died on the other side. Persian losses expand in victorious memory. Greek sacrifice becomes luminous. The immense empire becomes a backdrop against which the courage of defenders can be seen more clearly. The battles were decisive. Their later meaning was earned through genuine danger. Yet the more a battlefield becomes sacred to identity, the harder it becomes to see every death upon it without hierarchy. The Peloponnesian War removes any comfort that bloodshed belongs only to the clash between civilization and foreign threat. There, Greeks kill Greeks with methods sharpened by the very world they once defended together. Disease consumes crowded Athens. Plataea is destroyed despite its earlier service against Persia. Melos is annihilated not because it threatens Athenian survival, but because its independence offends Athenian power. In Sicily, the splendid expedition leaves amid prayers and confidence, then ends with broken ships, soldiers dying for water in a river, and prisoners wasting in stone quarries. The losses of that war cannot be reduced to one casualty figure because its violence works through duration. A field can be counted after combat, a generation eroded by plague, executions, enslavement, ruined harvests, lost fleets, civil faction, and imperial fear is harder to measure. Alexander's campaigns return the story to dazzling battlefield motion: the charge, the breached line, the fleeing king, the city taken after defiance, the world opened by victory. He defeats Persian armies at Issus and Gaugamela, takes Tyre after a siege whose aftermath stains every claim of noble conquest, and moves through regions later tied together by Greek language, royal foundations, trade, scholarship, and new political worlds. His achievement is immense. So is the human price hidden beneath the speed of his legend. Conquerors are remembered by the distance they travel. The defeated experience conquest as distance collapsing, as walls entered, families enslaved, royal authority replaced, food taken, and soldiers speaking unfamiliar languages standing where familiar power once stood. Kalinga interrupts the normal rhythm of triumph because Ashoka's own inscription makes suffering central. He claims that 100,000 were killed, 150,000 carried away, and many more died afterward. Those figures remain impossible to verify precisely, and even remorse can be shaped for imperial purpose. Yet the language matters. It recognizes that conquest injures not merely armies but households, dependents, religious communities, friends, parents, children, and the survivors left to inhabit a conquered world. Ashoka does not give Kalinga back. He remains emperor, but he leaves a rare admission that battlefield success can be a moral failure even for the man who orders it. Changping gives no such consolation. There, the traditional account of hundreds of thousands of Zhao soldiers killed, many after surrender, lies at the border between history and almost unbearable scale. Archaeological remains support the reality of violent death in the battlefield landscape, though they cannot yet confirm the full ancient number. Still, Changping may stand as the darkest single memory in this long passage through ancient war. Because the essential atrocity does not depend on the exact total. An enemy army was trapped, starved, defeated, and remembered as being destroyed deliberately after it ceased to pose an immediate threat in battle. If Cannae displays tactical brilliance turned into slaughter, Changping displays calculation without the fragile excuse of ongoing combat. The defeated are no longer men to be beaten. They are manpower to be removed from a rival state. At Cannae, Rome discovers how much killing a single day can contain. Ancient writers disagree over whether roughly 45,000, 50,000, or more than 70,000 Romans and allies died, but the order of magnitude remains appalling. The battle is unusually convincing as an example of concentrated battlefield destruction, because its structure explains the casualties: a huge infantry mass pressed forward, the centre yielded, the sides closed, cavalry completed the enclosure, and the surrounded army was reduced for hours within a shrinking perimeter. Yet even Cannae refuses to become a simple answer to the question of which battle was bloodiest. Rome survives. The state that suffers the massacre eventually destroys Carthage, enslaves defeated populations, and makes entire regions pay for the fear Hannibal once gave it. The ruins of Carthage and the campaigns in Gaul reveal the cruel instability of categories. When a city is stormed after siege, are its dead casualties of battle, massacre, or conquest. When tens of thousands are killed or sold after a revolt, when civilians are caught in a breached town, when hands are severed to make living warnings, the language of military history begins to hide more than it explains. Caesar's calm reports remain among the great surviving records of ancient campaigning. Yet they were written by the man whose advancement benefited from presenting devastation as necessity. In the ancient world, the victor often decides whether the dead are remembered as brave enemies, rebels, traitors, barbarians, captives, or simply totals. Teutoburg Forest and Adrianople offer another correction. Great armies do not die only before superior states or more brilliant conquerors. They die through assumption. Varus believes Roman authority is secure enough to move through a landscape whose alliances he misunderstands. Valens believes he can defeat the Goths before reinforcements arrive, after Roman officials have helped turn displaced refugees into desperate enemies. In both cases, later memory seeks a clear-cause treachery. Arrogance, barbarian ferocity, the beginning of imperial decline, the truth is less convenient and more valuable. Catastrophes form where several weaknesses meet failed intelligence, contempt for local realities, political pressure, logistical strain, divided command, difficult ground, and opponents capable of using Roman confidence against itself. Then there are Rome's civil wars, where the usual moral distance disappears, at Pharsalus, Philippi, and Actium. The armies are not protecting Rome from outsiders, they are answering competing Roman futures with Roman weapons. The casualties may be less enormous than the claims made for Changping or Kalinga, but their consequence is extraordinary. A republic that has mastered large-scale violence beyond its borders can no longer stop that violence from deciding authority at home. The final victor, Augustus, offers peace. And exhausted people accept it because the alternative has become a world in which every political conflict may produce armies, confiscations, posted death lists, starvation, and another field of citizen bodies. So which was the bloodiest ancient battle? The honest answer depends upon what the word means. If it means the greatest reported slaughter associated with one campaign, Changping and Kalinga stand among the most terrible claims, though their numbers cannot be independently proven. If it means the clearest mass killing compressed into one tactical encounter, Cannae remains one of the strongest candidates, its mechanism of destruction understood even while its exact total remains disputed. If it includes sieges, civilian deaths, deportation, enslavement, famine, disease, and the aftermath of conquest, then any simple ranking begins to fail. Carthage, Gaul, Sicily, and Kalinga remind us that a battle's dead may be only the visible centre of a wider disaster. Ancient writers give numbers because numbers make victory monumental. Modern readers seek numbers because numbers appear to offer certainty. But the most reliable understanding comes from holding different kinds of evidence together, without forcing them to say more than they can. Bones can demonstrate injury and mass death, but may not identify the political cause. Inscriptions can establish that rulers wished battles remembered, but may exaggerate or omit. Histories can preserve movements, speeches, landscapes, and outcomes, but may carry the loyalties of their authors and the moral needs of later generations. Fortifications, weapons, destruction layers, coins, mass burials, roads, and environmental reconstruction can restore parts of events once thought unreachable, while leaving crucial questions unresolved. No single form of evidence owns the truth. The dead survive in fragments because the past itself survives in fragments. What they reveal most clearly is not that ancient people were uniquely brutal, nor that violence follows one inevitable path from village quarrel to empire. They reveal that organisation magnifies consequence. A small group can kill horribly. A city can destroy a neighbouring city. A kingdom can assemble chariots and transform royal ambition into heaps of bodies. An empire can move armies across continents, deport populations, erase rivals, and record the result as order. And a state built to conduct war abroad can one day find that the machinery works just as efficiently when aimed inward. The bloodiest ancient battles endure because they mark moments when human systems become visible at their limit. Food supply becomes starvation, training becomes enclosure, loyalty becomes civil war, administration becomes exploitation, victory becomes remorse, or worse, the absence of remorse. The names of most of the dead are lost, but they are not merely background to the lives of commanders. They are the substance of every triumph claimed above them, every monument, every treaty. Every annexed province, every restored capital, every glorious campaign route passes through the same narrow gate, the people whose bodies made political change possible and whose silence allowed others to speak for them afterward. The battlefields are quieter now. The marshy river at Tollens moves through reeds and fields without explaining why men once died along its banks. At Megiddo, the roads that made a city worth fighting for still cross a landscape layered with armies long vanished. The pass at Thermopylae no longer has the exact shoreline its defenders knew, but the memory of those enclosed hours remains fixed upon it. At Cannae, open ground holds the invisible shape of a trap whose lines closed more than 2,000 years ago. At Changping, fragments from the soil keep returning the story to bodies whenever its numbers seem too immense to believe. Near Adrianople, the empire's lost emperor has no certain grave, only the knowledge that somewhere on that field his rank ended with his life. Time softens battlefields more quickly than it softens the consequences of battles. Grass grows where armies fell, rivers change course, walls are dismantled, stones reused, weapons corroded into unrecognisable forms. Cities destroyed in fire may rise again under new rulers and new names. Descendants of victors and defeated may eventually live within worlds neither side imagined. What remains is uneven a mound, a relief, an inscription, a broken helmet, a layer of ash, a mass grave. A sentence written by a ruler who discovered too late that conquest had become sorrow. The ancient dead do not ask to be ranked. They do not know whether historians will place their battle above or below another in a ledger of destruction. They leave a simpler claim upon memory. They were alive in landscapes that once felt ordinary to them. They knew heat, dust, hunger, cold water, animal breath, leather straps, wood smoke, fear for family, confidence in companions, and perhaps the belief that they would see home again. Then policy, ambition, allegiance, mistake. Or necessity brought them to the place where history would use their deaths. Civilizations are often remembered through what they built: walls, temples, roads, libraries, laws, statues, tombs, and cities bright with trade. But they are also revealed by the fields where they spent human life to survive, expand, avenge themselves, or decide who would command the future. The ruins and bones do not erase achievement, they make it honest. And long after the shouting ends, after kings and empires have taken their places among the vanished, a quiet landscape remains beneath the sky. In the soil below it lie the people who paid for decisions once called necessary, glorious, or inevitable. Above them, the wind passes through grass that has no memory of banners, carrying no victory cry at all, only the silence into which every battle, however vast, eventually falls.